Somewhere in the forests of Cambodia, a stone face the size of a house has been watching the tree line for 800 years. Its eyes half closed, its lips curved into a smile that no one alive fully understands. The Khmer Empire rose from the floodplains of Southeast Asia and built monuments so vast that when European explorers first encountered them, they refused to believe local people had made them, assumed, instead, that these towers and reservoirs and endless corridors of carved sandstone must have belonged to some lost civilization, some forgotten race of giants. They were wrong, of course. The builders were here all along, their descendants still farming the same rice paddies that once fed 1 million people in a single city. If these quieter journeys help the night feel gentler, subscribing means more stories like this one will be waiting. The jungle has kept its secrets patiently, and now, slowly, we can begin to listen. And so we find ourselves drawn back in time to the warm and silted waters of the Mekong as it spreads itself across the lowlands of mainland Southeast Asia, a river that has always given life to those who settled along its generous banks. The story we are following now begins long before the great temples of Angkor rose from the jungle floor, long before the reservoirs and the causeways and the carved sandstone faces that would one day gaze serenely over the forest canopy. We must travel back to the first centuries of the Common Era, when the coastal regions of what is now southern Vietnam and Cambodia were home to a kingdom the Chinese chroniclers called Funan, a name that may derive from the Khmer word for mountain, though the land itself was largely flat and prone to seasonal flooding. This was, as far as we can determine from the available evidence, the earliest Indianized state in all of Southeast Asia, a place where the cultural and religious traditions of the Indian subcontinent first took root in the fertile soil of the Mekong Delta, mingling with local beliefs and practices to create something both familiar and entirely new. The origins of Funan are shrouded in the particular kind of haziness that settles over all ancient histories, where legend and fact become intertwined like the roots of banyan trees growing through temple stones. The Chinese historical text, known as the Liang Shu, compiled in the 7th century, but drawing on earlier sources, preserves a foundation myth that the Funanese themselves apparently told and retold across generations. According to this account, the kingdom was established by a Brahmin named Kondinya, a priest from India who arrived by sea, guided perhaps by a dream or by the promptings of fate. When he reached the shores of this new land, he encountered a woman of remarkable origin, a princess named Soma, who was said to be the daughter of the Naga king, ruler of the serpent spirits who dwell in waters and beneath the earth. The Nagas, in the cosmology of ancient India and the cultures it touched, were powerful beings associated with rainfall, rivers, fertility, and the hidden treasures of the deep places of the world. Soma, as the story goes, ruled over this coastal territory, and when Kondinya arrived with his Brahminical knowledge and his divine bow, a union was arranged between them, a marriage that joined the spiritual authority of India with the indigenous power of the land and its waters. This foundation myth, gentle as it sounds when told in the quiet hours, carries within it a kind of template that would be repeated throughout the history of Southeast Asian kingdoms, a narrative pattern in which foreign influence, often imagined as masculine and associated with the sky or with learned traditions, joins with local power, often imagined as feminine and associated with the earth or the waters. Whether Kondinya was a historical person or a composite figure representing waves of Brahmin traders, priests, and adventurers who gradually introduced Indian customs to the region. We cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that by the early centuries of the Common Era, the people of Funan had adopted Sanskrit as a language of ritual and royal inscription, had embraced aspects of both Hindu and Buddhist religious practice, and had organized themselves into a kingdom capable of engaging in long-distance maritime trade. The location of Funan was exceptionally well suited to such trade, for the Mekong Delta sits at a natural crossroads where ships traveling between India and China might stop to take on fresh water and provisions, to wait out unfavorable winds, or to exchange goods with local merchants. The monsoon winds that governed ancient navigation in these waters blew from the southwest for half the year, and from the northeast for the other half, creating a rhythm of arrival and departure that shaped the commercial calendar of every port along the coast. Funan, with its access to the resources of the interior through the Mekong River system, and its position along the maritime route connecting the Bay of Bengal to the South China Sea, became a prosperous entrepot, a place where merchants from many lands might meet and trade silk, spices, gold, precious stones, aromatic woods, and the countless other commodities that flowed along the ancient networks of exchange. The archaeological site of Angkor Wat, located in the Takeo province of modern Cambodia, offers us a glimpse into this early world, though much remains buried beneath rice paddies and vegetation, waiting patiently for future generations of researchers. Excavations at Angkor Wat have revealed the remains of a substantial settlement, with brick structures, canals, and artifacts suggesting a community of considerable sophistication and wealth. Among the objects recovered from this site are coins minted in the distant Roman Empire, small bronze discs bearing the images of emperors who ruled on the other side of the known world. These coins, likely brought to Funan through the intermediary networks of Indian Ocean trade, remind us that even in this early period, the Mekong Delta was connected, however indirectly, to a global system of exchange that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. The presence of Roman coins at Angkor Wat does not mean that Roman merchants themselves visited these shores, though it is not impossible, but rather that goods and currency moved hand to hand across vast distances, passing through many intermediaries before coming to rest in the jewelry boxes or offering plates of Funanese households. Funan flourished for several centuries, its kings sending embassies to the Chinese court and receiving in return the recognition that enhanced their prestige at home. The Chinese records describe Funan as a powerful state, its people living in houses raised on stilts above the floodwaters, its rulers adorned with pearls and gold, its temples dedicated to both Hindu deities and the Buddha. But as with all kingdoms, the fortunes of Funan eventually waned, and by the 6th century, power had begun to shift northward, away from the coastal delta and toward the middle reaches of the Mekong, where a new polity was emerging from the forests and the hills. This new power came to be known as Chenla, a name that also appears in Chinese sources and may derive from a local place name or ethnic designation. The transition from Funan to Chenla was not a sudden overthrow or a dramatic conquest, or at least the evidence does not support such a narrative, but rather a gradual shift in the balance of power as the center of political gravity moved inland. The king, who is most often credited with establishing Chenla as a major force, was Jayavarman VII, who reigned in the latter half of the 6th century, and whose inscriptions have been found across a wide area of what is now Cambodia and southern Laos. Jayavarman I, along with his brother and successor Mahendravarman and his nephew Suryavarman I extended Chenla's control over former Funnanese territories, incorporating the coastal regions into a larger kingdom that stretched from the sea to the uplands. The rulers of Chenla, like those of Funan before them, adopted Sanskrit for their royal inscriptions and embraced the Hindu religion, particularly the worship of Shiva, though Buddhism also maintained a presence. The title Varman, meaning protector or shield, which appears in the names of Chenla's kings, would become a standard element of Khmer royal nomenclature, passed down through centuries to the builders of Angkor and beyond. These early kings presented themselves as Chakravartins, universal rulers whose power was sanctioned by the gods, and they sponsored the construction of temples and the endowment of religious foundations, establishing patterns of royal patronage that would continue for many hundreds of years. Among the most significant sites associated with the Chenla period is Wat Phu, located in the Champasak province of modern Laos, on the western bank of the Mekong. Wat Phu occupies a dramatic setting at the base of a mountain whose peak, seen from certain angles, resembles a linga, the phallic symbol associated with Shiva, and this natural formation may have attracted worshippers to the site long before any permanent structures were built. Sanskrit inscriptions found at Wat Phu predate the Angkorian period by several centuries, confirming that this was a holy place of considerable importance during the era of Chenla. The temples that stand at Wat Phu today were largely constructed later, during the Angkorian period, but they rest upon foundations and traditions established in these earlier centuries, when the Proto-Khmer kingdoms were still finding their form. For a time, Chenla appears to have been a unified kingdom, or at least a collection of territories acknowledging a single paramount ruler. But by the early 8th century, the political situation had become fragmented. Chinese sources from this period distinguish between two entities, which they call Land Chenla and Water Chenla, a division that may reflect geographical and ecological differences between the interior uplands and the lower-lying coastal and riverine regions. Land Chenla, in the Chinese accounts, is described as relatively stable and orderly, while Water Chenla is portrayed as chaotic, prone to violence and misrule. The reasons for this split, which seems to have occurred around 706 CE or thereabouts, are not entirely clear from the surviving evidence, but the result was a period of political disunity that left the region vulnerable to external pressures and internal conflicts. Among those external pressures were the raids of the Cham people, who inhabited the coastal regions of what is now central and southern Vietnam. The Kingdom of Champa, which flourished alongside and often in competition with the Khmer kingdoms, was itself an Indianized state with its own rich traditions of Hindu and Buddhist culture, its own Sanskrit inscriptions, and its own impressive temple complexes built in honor of Shiva and other deities. But the relationship between Champa and its neighbors to the west was frequently hostile, and Cham naval forces launched raids along the coasts and up the rivers of water, Chenla, disrupting trade, capturing prisoners, and destabilizing an already fractured political landscape. The instability of this period, with its multiple competing rulers and its vulnerability to Cham attacks, created the conditions from which a new unifying force would eventually emerge. The exact sequence of events is difficult to reconstruct with confidence, as the surviving inscriptions are fragmentary and the Chinese accounts are sometimes contradictory. But we know that in the early 9th century, a king named Jayavarman II would declare himself Chakravartin, universal ruler, and would establish his capital in the region of Angkor. inaugurating the era of the great temple-building kings, whose monuments would one day draw travelers and pilgrims from around the world. But that story belongs to a later section of our journey, and for now, we may simply note that the seeds of Angkorian greatness were planted in the soil of Chenla, watered by the Mekong, and nurtured by centuries of cultural exchange with India, China, and the wider world. The legacy of Funan and Chenla lives on in the inscriptions carved on stone, in the foundations buried beneath later temples, and in the myths and legends that the Khmer people continued to tell about their origins long after the names of individual kings had been forgotten. The story of Kondinya and Soma, the Brahmin and the Serpent Princess, would be retold in the courts of Angkor and would find echoes in the iconography of temples built many centuries after the fall of Funan. The tradition of Sanskrit learning, established in these early kingdoms, would produce a rich literature of royal panegyrics, religious hymns, and philosophical texts, much of which has been lost, but some of which survives to tell us of the intellectual and spiritual aspirations of these ancient rulers, and the networks of trade and diplomacy that connected Funan and Chenla to India, China, and the maritime world of Southeast Asia would continue to shape the economic and cultural life of the Khmer Empire throughout its long history. The Mekong, that great river that rises in the highlands of Tibet and flows southward through gorges and valleys before spreading itself across the lowlands of Cambodia and Vietnam, remains the constant in this story, as steady and as patient as the flow of time itself. On its banks, kingdoms rose and fell, temples were built and abandoned, inscriptions were carved and weathered away, and generation after generation of farmers planted their rice and tended their fields, their labors supporting the priests and the kings and the scholars whose names have come down to us through the centuries. The river does not remember Kondinya or Jayavarman, does not recall the Cham raids or the split between land Chenla and water Chenla, but it flows on, as it always has, carrying silt and water and the reflected light of the sun toward the distant sea. And so we come now to the figure who stands at the very beginning of what we recognize as the classical Khmer Empire, a ruler whose life and reign would set in motion nearly 6 centuries of extraordinary civilization in the heart of Southeast Asia. His name was Jayavarman II, and his story begins not in the lands he would come to rule, but far across the sea, on the island of Java, where he had spent his youth in circumstances that remain somewhat unclear to historians even today. Some scholars believe he was held there as a political hostage, a common practice among ancient kingdoms seeking to ensure the good behavior of vassal states or conquered territories. Others suggest he may have been sent there for his education, to learn the sophisticated arts of statecraft and religion that flourished in the Javanese courts. Whatever the precise nature of his time abroad, we know that around the year 790 of the Common Era, this young prince returned to the Khmer lands, and he returned with ambitions that would reshape the entire region. The world he came back to was one of fragmentation and division, a patchwork of small competing kingdoms and chieftaincies that had once, perhaps, acknowledged some form of shared identity, but had long since drifted into mutual rivalry and occasional conflict. The great days of Funan and Chenla, those earlier Khmer and pre-Khmer states, had faded into memory, and the territory that would become Cambodia was divided among numerous local rulers, each jealously guarding their own small domains. For a young man with visions of unity and empire, this fractured landscape presented both a challenge and an opportunity, and Jayavarman II proved himself remarkably adept at seizing that opportunity over the decades that followed. His campaigns to unite these scattered territories were neither swift nor simple, and the historical record, such as it is, suggests a long process of military conquest, political alliance, and careful diplomacy that unfolded over many years. We must understand that our knowledge of this period comes to us in fragments, pieced together from inscriptions carved in stone, centuries after the events they describe, and from the physical evidence left behind in the foundations of temples and the layouts of ancient cities. The most important of these textual sources is an inscription found at a place called Zdok Kok Thom, which we shall return to shortly, as it provides us with much of what we know about these formative years of the empire. What emerges from these sources is a picture of a ruler who was constantly in motion, establishing his authority in one region before moving on to consolidate power in another, founding capitals and then abandoning them as his sphere of influence expanded. One of his early centers of power was a place called Indrapura, located in what is now the eastern part of Cambodia, near the modern border with Vietnam. Here he established one of his first royal courts, drawing together supporters and beginning the long work of building a unified kingdom. But Indrapura was not to be his permanent home, and in time he moved his capital westward, following the opportunities presented by the rich agricultural lands around the Great Lake, known as the Tonle Sap, that remarkable body of water that swells to many times its dry season size during the monsoon months, creating one of the most productive freshwater fisheries in the world and depositing fertile sediments across the surrounding plains. His next major capital was established at a place called Hariharalaya, located in the area that would later become the core of the Angkor region, not far from the modern town of Siem Reap. The name Hariharalaya itself is significant, combining as it does the names of two great Hindu deities, Hari being another name for Vishnu and Hara being another name for Shiva, suggesting perhaps a deliberate attempt to unite the followers of both great gods under a single royal authority. Here, among the waterways and rice fields of the lowlands, Jayavarman II built temples and established the administrative structures that would support his growing kingdom. The remains of this early capital can still be traced today in a group of temple sites known collectively as the Reservoirs group. Though the structures visible, they were largely built by his successors rather than by Jayavarman II himself. But it was not in the lowlands that the most significant moment of his reign would occur. Sometime around the year 802 of the Common Era, Jayavarman II ascended a sacred mountain, a place called in the inscriptions Mount Mahendra Parvata, which modern scholars have identified with the plateau known today as Phnom Kulen, rising some 400 meters above the surrounding plains to the northeast of what would become Angkor. This mountain, covered in dense jungle and watered by numerous streams that cascade down its slopes in picturesque waterfalls, held deep spiritual significance, and it was here that a ceremony took place that would define the ideological foundation of the Khmer Empire for centuries to come. The ceremony was performed by a Brahmin priest named Hiranyadama, a religious specialist who had been trained in the sacred rituals that originated in India, but had been adapted and transformed through centuries of practice in Southeast Asia. What Hiranyadama performed on that jungle-covered mountain was the establishment of a religious and political concept known as the Devaraja cult, a Sanskrit term that can be translated as meaning the cult of the God King. This ritual created a profound connection between the earthly ruler and the divine realm, specifically linking the person of the king to the great Hindu god Shiva, the destroyer and transformer within the Hindu trinity. The concept is both simple and profound, and it rests upon an identification of the king with Shiva through the medium of a sacred object called a linga. The linga, in Hindu religious practice, is a symbolic representation of Shiva, typically taking the form of a cylindrical or slightly tapered stone set upon a square base called a yoni, which represents the goddess Shakti, Shiva's female counterpart and source of creative energy. Together, the linga and yoni symbolize the union of male and female principles, the cosmic forces of creation and sustenance that maintain the universe in being. In the context of the Devaraja cult, a special linga was established as a sort of spiritual double of the king himself, a sacred object in which resided a portion of Shiva's divine essence, and which was intimately connected to the life force and royal authority of the ruling monarch. This royal linga was not simply an image to be worshipped from afar, but a living center of spiritual power that required constant ritual attention, the performance of ceremonies, the offering of flowers and incense and food, and the chanting of sacred texts by trained priests. The maintenance of this cult became a central responsibility of the Khmer state, and special lineages of priests were established, whose duty it was to perform these rituals generation after generation. The inscription at Stokhok Tom Thom, which we mentioned earlier, actually traces one such priestly lineage through more than 2 centuries, from the time of Jayavarman II down to the mid-11th century when the inscription was carved. And it is from this remarkable document that we draw much of our knowledge about the founding ceremony on Mount Mahendra Parvata. This inscription was created in the year 1052 of the Common Era, some 250 years after the events it describes, and it tells the story of a family of royal chaplains who had served the Khmer kings since the time of Jayavarman VII himself. According to this text, it was Hiranyadharma who performed the ritual that freed the Khmer kingdom from any spiritual allegiance to Java, establishing it as an independent realm under the protection of Shiva, with a king who was himself a manifestation of the god's power on earth. The inscription describes how Jayavarman II invited Hiranyadharma to perform a ceremony that would make the land of the Khmers what the text calls Kamraten Jagat Taraja, which can be understood as meaning a supreme sovereign realm, no longer subject to any foreign power, whether earthly or spiritual. The practical political implications of this religious innovation were immense. By establishing himself as a god king, a living connection between the human world and the divine, Jayavarman II created a source of legitimacy that transcended the ordinary claims of military strength or noble birth. Other local rulers might challenge his armies or question his lineage, but they could not easily dispute his claim to divine authority, validated as it was by the most sophisticated religious rituals available in the Indic tradition. The Devaraja cult gave the Khmer kings a spiritual prestige that helped to bind together the diverse peoples and territories of their expanding realm, creating a shared focus of loyalty that supplemented the more mundane bonds of political alliance and military conquest. The mountain itself, Phnom Kulen, remained a place of great sanctity throughout the centuries of Khmer civilization, and pilgrims still visit it today to venerate the numerous religious carvings and sculptures that dot its slopes. Among these are images of reclining Vishnus carved directly into the beds of streams, so that the holy waters flow over the divine forms in an endless natural ablution. There are also numerous lingas carved into the rock, some of them in great clusters of hundreds of individual stones, sanctifying the waters that flow down to irrigate the plains below. But the true extent of what Jayavarman II and his immediate successors built on this sacred mountain remained hidden until quite recently. In the years 2012 and 2013, an international team of archaeologists employed a technology called LIDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, to peer beneath the dense jungle canopy that covers Phnom Kulen and the surrounding region. This technology, which involves mounting a laser scanner on an aircraft and measuring the precise distance to the ground by timing the return of millions of laser pulses, can effectively strip away vegetation to reveal the underlying topography of the land surface. What the LIDAR surveys revealed was nothing less than astonishing, at least to those archaeologists who had spent their careers studying the Khmer civilization. Beneath the jungle on Phnom Kulen lay the remains of a vast city, far larger than anyone had previously imagined, with an elaborate grid of streets, numerous temple foundations, canals for water management, and extensive residential areas. This lost city, which some scholars have tentatively identified as Mahendraparvata itself, the original sacred capital of Jayavarman II, predates the great temples of Angkor by centuries and represents one of the earliest large-scale urban developments in the region. The LIDAR data showed that the city extended over an area of approximately 36 square kilometers, making it one of the largest pre-industrial settlements ever documented in the archaeological record. Here, it seems, was where the Khmer Empire truly began, not on the plains below where Angkor would later rise, but high on this jungle-covered mountain, hidden from scholarly eyes until technology finally allowed us to see through the trees. The discovery of this early city has forced researchers to reconsider many of their assumptions about the development of Khmer civilization. It now appears that the techniques of urban planning, water management, and monumental construction that would reach their fullest expression at Angkor were first developed and refined here on Phnom Kulen under Jayavarman II and his immediate successors. The mountain city served as a kind of proving ground, a place where the administrative and engineering skills necessary to manage a large population could be developed in relative security, before being applied on an even larger scale in the lowlands below. Jayavarman II himself ruled for an exceptionally long period, approximately 50 years by most scholarly estimates, though the exact dates of his reign remain somewhat uncertain. This length of rule was itself a remarkable achievement in an age when warfare, disease, and political intrigue carried off many rulers long before their time. His long reign provided the stability necessary for his new political and religious order to take root, allowing time for the institutions of the Devaraja cult to become established, for the priestly lineages to pass their knowledge from one generation to the next, and for the kingdom itself to become accustomed to thinking of itself as a unified entity, rather than a collection of separate territories. When Jayavarman II finally died, around the year 835 of the Common Era, he left behind not just a kingdom, but the ideological and institutional foundations of an empire that would endure for 600 years and create some of the most remarkable monuments in human history. And so we come now to the waters, to the great reservoirs that the Khmer people called Baray, and to the remarkable systems of channels and canals that spread across the landscape like the gentlest of nets cast over the earth, gathering and holding and releasing water in ways that allowed an entire civilization to flourish in a place where the rains fell heavily for part of the year, and then scarcely at all for many months afterward. And it is a story of patient engineering, of generations of workers moving earth by the basketful, and of rulers who understood that to control water was to control life itself. And we shall take our time with this, following the slow progress of the channels as they wound through the forest and across the plain. Because there is no hurry here, only the quiet accumulation of facts about one of the most sophisticated hydraulic systems the ancient world ever produced. The monsoon climate of mainland Southeast Asia presents what might seem an insurmountable problem to anyone wishing to grow rice on a large scale, for the rains arrive with tremendous force between roughly May and October, drenching the land and swelling the rivers and filling every low place with standing water. And then they depart, leaving behind a dry season that stretches from November through April, during which very little precipitation falls at all, and the rivers shrink back within their banks, and the earth grows parched and hard, and any crops that depend upon regular moisture must either be harvested before the dry season begins, or must somehow receive water from sources other than the sky. And the Khmer engineers, working across centuries and learning from each generation's successes and failures, develop methods for capturing the abundant waters of the wet season and storing them for use during the dry months. And the great Barays were the most visible monuments to this effort, though they were only the largest components of a system that reached into every corner of the settled landscape. The first of the truly grand reservoirs was the Indra Tataka, which was constructed under the direction of King Indravarman I around the year 877 of the Common Era. And this was not the first attempt by Khmer rulers to build large water storage facilities, for there had been earlier and smaller efforts at various sites. But the Indra Tataka represented a new scale of ambition and a new level of organization, for it measured approximately 3.8 kilometers in length and 800 meters in width, which is to say that it stretched across the landscape like a great rectangular lake, oriented from east to west, and its construction required the movement of enormous quantities of earth to build up the embankments that contained the water. And these embankments, or dikes, were made primarily of laterite soil and clay, materials that were readily available in the region and that, when properly compacted, could hold back millions of cubic meters of water without seeping or crumbling away. And the Indra Tataka was positioned to the north of the temple complex known as the Bakong, which was Indravarman's state temple. And together the temple and the reservoir formed a statement of royal power and divine favor. For the king who could command the waters was understood to possess something of the creative power of the gods themselves. The workers who built these reservoirs were organized into vast labor crews, and though we do not have detailed records of exactly how this labor was managed, we can infer from the scale of the projects and from inscriptions that mention the dedication of workers to temple construction that the Khmer kings commanded the services of very large numbers of people, perhaps including both free laborers fulfilling obligations to the state and enslaved individuals who belonged to temples or to noble households. And the earth was moved in baskets carried on the heads or shoulders of workers, for the Khmer did not employ wheeled vehicles or draft animals for heavy hauling in the manner of some other ancient civilizations. And so every cubic meter of soil that went into the embankments of the Indra Tataka was carried there by human effort, basket by basket. And when one contemplates the millions of baskets that must have been required, the mind grows quiet with a kind of gentle wonder at the patience and persistence of those long-ago laborers. The Indra Tataka was impressive, but it was surpassed within only a few years by an even more ambitious project, the East Baray, which is also known by its Sanskrit name, Yashodh Hara Tataka, meaning the reservoir of Yashodhara. And this great body of water was constructed by Jayavarman I, who came to the throne in approximately 889 of the Common Era, and who moved the capital to a new site that would eventually become the great city of Angkor. And the East Baray was enormous, measuring approximately 7.5 kilometers in length and 1.8 kilometers in width. And when filled to capacity, it could hold an estimated 55 million cubic meters of water, which is a quantity difficult to imagine, but which might be pictured as a lake covering an area slightly smaller than the island of Manhattan, and deep enough in places to submerge a two-story building. And this vast reservoir was created not by digging a great pit, for the water table in the region was quite high, and excavation would quickly fill with groundwater, but rather by constructing massive embankments that rose above the level of the surrounding plain, enclosing an area into which water could flow from the Siem Reap River and from the runoff of the monsoon rains. And the embankments were planted with trees to stabilize them and to provide shade. And the reservoir became a feature of the landscape that shaped the development of the city around it for centuries to come. The construction of the East Baray under Jayavarman was accompanied by the building of numerous other waterworks, including canals that connected the reservoir to the river system and to the agricultural lands that surrounded the growing city. And inscriptions from this period record the dedication of the reservoir in religious ceremonies that linked the waters to the gods and to the prosperity of the kingdom. And the Baray was not merely a utilitarian structure, but also a sacred space, associated with the cosmic ocean, that in Hindu mythology surrounds the world. And the island temple, known as the Mebon, which was constructed in the center of the East Baray during the reign of a later king, reinforced this symbolic connection between the reservoir and the divine waters of creation. And so the Great Barays served multiple purposes at once, storing water for practical use, while also embodying the religious and cosmological ideas that gave meaning to Khmer civilization. The water held in the Barays was distributed across the landscape through an intricate network of canals and channels that stretched, according to modern archaeological surveys, for more than 1,000 kilometers in total length. And this network allowed water to be directed to rice paddies throughout the dry season, enabling farmers to plant and harvest not just once, but as many as 3 times per year in some areas. And this intensive rice cultivation produced the agricultural surplus that supported the large population of the Angkorian region and funded the construction of the temples and palaces that we admire today. And the canals were of various sizes, from major channels that might be tens of meters wide to smaller distribution channels only a meter or two across, and the flow of water through this system was controlled by means of sluice gates, some of which were made of wood and have been discovered by archaeologists in excavations at various points along the canal network. And these wooden gates could be raised or lowered to direct water into particular channels or to hold it back when needed. And the existence of such gates indicates a level of active management and maintenance that required ongoing labor and expertise. The West Baray was the third of the great reservoirs, constructed during the reign of Suryavarman I in the early 11th century of the Common Era, and it was similar in size to the East Baray, measuring approximately 8 kilometers in length and 2.2 kilometers in width, and it remains partially filled with water to this day. Unlike the East Baray, which dried up centuries ago and is now a patchwork of rice fields and scrubland. And the West Baray is thus the only one of the great Angkorian reservoirs where one can still see water reflecting the sky, and can perhaps imagine something of what the landscape looked like when the Khmer hydraulic system was functioning at its full capacity. And fishermen still cast their nets in the West Baray today. and families come on weekends to swim and to picnic along its shores. And in this way, the ancient engineering continues to serve the people of the region, though in a diminished form compared to its original purpose. The understanding of the Angkorian hydraulic system has been greatly advanced in recent decades by the research of scholars, including Roland Fletcher of the University of Sydney and Christophe Potier of the École Française d'Extrême-Orient, who have used a combination of traditional archaeological survey methods and modern technologies, including aerial photography, satellite imagery, and airborne laser scanning, also known as LIDAR, to map the landscape around Angkor in unprecedented detail. And their work has revealed that Angkor was not a compact city in the manner of medieval European cities or ancient cities of the Mediterranean world, but rather what Fletcher has termed a low-density urban complex, a vast expanse of settlement that covered approximately 1,000 square kilometers and that integrated residential areas, temples, agricultural land, and water management infrastructure into a single interconnected system. And this pattern of settlement was made possible precisely by the hydraulic network, which allowed intensive agriculture to take place throughout the urban area and which shaped the placement of roads, temples, and neighborhoods according to the flow and distribution of water. The discovery of this vast urban footprint has changed how scholars think about pre-modern cities and about the relationship between urbanization and environment. For Angkor, at its peak, may have been the largest city in the world by area, though its population density was much lower than that of contemporaneous cities in China or the Islamic world. And this low-density pattern of settlement placed great demands on the surrounding landscape and on the hydraulic infrastructure that supported it, for the system required constant maintenance and was vulnerable to disruption from various causes, including sedimentation of the canals, erosion of the embankments, and changes in the regional climate. The question of why Angkor declined as a major center of power in the 14th and 15th centuries has occupied scholars for generations, and various explanations have been proposed, including military pressure from the Thai kingdoms to the west, economic changes related to maritime trade, and religious transformations associated with the spread of Theravada Buddhism. But in recent years, increasing attention has been paid to the possibility that problems with the hydraulic system played a significant role in Angkor's decline, and studies of tree rings and sediment cores from the region have revealed that mainland Southeast Asia experienced significant climate variability during the 14th and 15th centuries, including both severe droughts and unusually intense monsoon seasons. And such climatic extremes would have placed great stress on a water management system that was designed to operate within a certain range of conditions. And there is evidence that the later Angkorian kings attempted to modify and expand the hydraulic infrastructure, perhaps in response to such stresses, but that these efforts were ultimately insufficient to maintain the system's function, and the breakdown of the water supply would have had cascading effects on agriculture, population, and political stability, though the exact sequence of events remains a subject of ongoing research and debate. The wooden sluice gates and distribution channels that have been discovered by archaeologists are fragile traces of the daily management of water that once took place across this landscape, and they remind us that the great Barays and canals were not static monuments, but living infrastructure that required the constant attention of workers and officials. And when that attention could no longer be sustained, whether due to political instability or climate change or some combination of factors, the system began to fail, and the waters that had brought life to the fields instead brought flooding or stagnation, and the population that had depended on the rice harvest gradually dispersed to other areas, and the forest crept back over the canals and the embankments, and the great reservoirs silted up and dried out, and only the temples remained visible above the trees, monuments to a civilization whose mastery of water had made everything else possible. And now, as you rest and let your thoughts drift like water finding its own level, you might picture those ancient engineers standing on the embankments of the east, Baray, as the monsoon clouds gathered on the horizon, watching the first rains begin to fall, and knowing that the system they had built would gather those waters and hold them and release them slowly across the land in the months to come. A patient and methodical process that would continue, season after season, for centuries, until at last it did not, and the waters found other paths, and the jungle returned, and the reservoirs became fields, and the fields became forests, and the forests held the temples in their green embrace. And so we come now to the temple that has, in many ways, come to represent an entire civilization in the minds of people around the world. The temple, whose silhouette appears on the Cambodian flag itself, rising in those familiar stepped towers against a background of red and blue. This is Angkor Wat, and the story of its construction is one of tremendous ambition, extraordinary engineering, and a devotion to the divine that expressed itself through stone on a scale that remains, even today, rather difficult to fully comprehend. We will take our time with this temple, allowing the details to unfold gently, because the builders themselves were not in any particular hurry, and their patience across decades of labor produced something that has endured for nearly 9 centuries. The king who conceived of Angkor Wat was Suryavarman II, who came to power around the year 1113 of the Common Era, though the exact circumstances of his rise remain somewhat obscured by the passage of time. What we do know is that he was an ambitious ruler, a military campaigner who extended Khmer influence across a vast territory, and a devout follower of the god Vishnu, which marked something of a departure from several of his predecessors who had favored Shiva as their primary deity. This theological preference would shape the character of Angkor Wat in fundamental ways, from its orientation to its iconography. And we see in Suryavarman's choice a continuity with certain earlier traditions, while also establishing something distinctly his own. The construction of the temple likely began shortly after his accession to the throne, perhaps around 1116 or so, and it would continue for approximately 3 decades, with some scholars suggesting that the final decorative elements were still being completed as late as 1150, which was roughly the year of the king's death, though the precise date of his passing remains uncertain. The temple was dedicated to Vishnu, the preserver, one of the principal deities of the Hindu pantheon, and this dedication helps to explain certain distinctive features of the complex that we will explore in due course. The name Angkor Wat itself is not the original designation of the temple, which was likely called Vra Vishnuloka, meaning the sacred dwelling of Vishnu, or something similar in the Old Khmer language. The name we use today derives from the later period when the temple was converted to Buddhist use, with Angkor being a corruption of the Sanskrit word Nagara, meaning city, and Wat being the Khmer word for temple, so Angkor Wat simply means city temple, a rather modest name for so grand a structure. But names aside, the temple that Suryavarman commissioned was intended as nothing less than an earthly representation of the cosmic mountain at the center of the universe, Mount Meru, where the gods were believed to reside, and every element of its design was calculated to reinforce this sacred symbolism. Let us begin with the dimensions of the complex. which are really quite remarkable when one takes the time to consider them carefully. The outer boundary of Angkor Wat is defined by a vast moat, a rectangular body of water that measures approximately 1.5 kilometers from north to south, and approximately 1.3 kilometers from east to west, creating a perimeter of roughly 5.5 kilometers around the temple proper. This moat is not merely decorative, though it is certainly beautiful, particularly in the early morning light when the towers are reflected in the still water. The moat served practical purposes in managing water flow and stabilizing the foundations, but it also carried profound symbolic significance, representing the cosmic ocean that was believed to surround Mount Meru in Hindu cosmology. Crossing the moat, one would have felt oneself leaving the ordinary world behind and entering a sacred realm where the normal rules of existence gave way to divine presence. Within the moat, the temple rises in a series of 3 concentric rectangular galleries, each one higher than the last, leading the eye and the pilgrim upward toward the central sanctuary. The outermost gallery is surrounded by an enclosure wall that measures approximately 1,000 meters by 800 meters, enclosing an area of some 80 hectares, though the temple structure itself occupies a smaller portion of this space. At the heart of the complex, the central tower rises to a height of approximately 65 meters above the ground, which made it, at the time of its construction, one of the tallest structures in the world. This tower was crowned with a golden finial that would have caught the sunlight and announced the temple's presence across the surrounding landscape. Though this original finial has long since been lost, 4 subsidiary towers surround the central peak, arranged in a quincunx pattern, and together these 5 towers represented the 5 peaks of Mount Meru, bringing the cosmic mountain down to earth in laterite and sandstone. The construction of Angkor Wat required materials on an almost unimaginable scale, and the logistics of assembling these materials remain a subject of considerable scholarly interest. The core of the temple structures was built from laterite, a reddish iron-rich stone that could be cut into blocks while still soft and then hardened when exposed to air, providing a sturdy foundation for the more decorative elements. But the visible surfaces, the intricately carved facades, and the smoothly fitted walls that visitors see today were constructed primarily from sandstone, and the quantity of sandstone required was truly extraordinary. Estimates vary, but scholars have suggested that somewhere between 5 million and 10 million individual sandstone blocks were used in the construction of Angkor Wat, representing a volume of stone that has been compared to the material used in the Great Pyramid of Giza, though distributed across a much larger area and requiring far more intricate carving work. These sandstone blocks were quarried from the slopes of Phnom Kulen, a mountain plateau located approximately 50 kilometers to the northeast of the Angkor region. This was no small distance to transport heavy stone, and some of the larger blocks weighed as much as 1,500 kilograms, requiring considerable ingenuity and labor to move them. The most likely method involved floating the blocks along a series of canals that connected the quarries to the temple site, taking advantage of the extensive water management infrastructure that the Khmer had developed over centuries. During the rainy season, when water levels were high, barges laden with stone could make their way down from the mountain, eventually reaching the network of waterways that surrounded Angkor. Teams of workers would then have hauled the blocks into position using a combination of ramps, rollers, levers, and perhaps elephants, though the exact techniques remain matters of scholarly reconstruction rather than documented fact. The workforce required for such an undertaking was necessarily immense. And while no precise records survive, modern estimates suggest that the construction of Angkor Wat may have employed as many as 300,000 laborers at its peak, including quarry workers, stone cutters, carvers, engineers, supervisors, and the countless support workers who fed, clothed, and housed this vast assembly of people. The orchestration of such a workforce across multiple decades represents an administrative achievement every bit as impressive as the architectural one, requiring sophisticated systems of organization, supply, and compensation that speak to the complexity of Khmer society during its classical period. Among those involved in the design and oversight of the temple, inscriptions mention a figure named Devaraja Pandita, who appears to have served as a principal architect or chief priest, overseeing the construction, though our knowledge of his specific contributions remains limited. One of the most celebrated features of Angkor Wat is its extraordinary program of sculptural decoration, which covers vast expanses of the temple's walls with intricate bas-relief carvings depicting scenes from Hindu mythology, historical events, and the daily life of the Khmer court. The most extensive of these decorative elements is found in the outer gallery, where a continuous frieze stretches for approximately 800 meters around the perimeter, making it one of the longest continuous bas-relief panels anywhere in the world. Walking along this gallery, which one may do quite slowly and contemplatively, one encounters scene after scene carved with remarkable skill and attention to detail, the figures rendered in shallow relief against a smooth background, their gestures elegant and their expressions serene. Among the most famous of these bas-relief panels is the depiction of the churning of the ocean of milk, a creation myth central to Hindu cosmology that tells how the gods and demons cooperated, for once, to churn the cosmic ocean using Mount Mandara as a churning stick and the serpent Vasuki as a rope. By churning the ocean in this manner, they sought to extract Amrita, the nectar of immortality, along with various other treasures and beings that emerged from the primordial waters. The scene at Angkor Wat shows the gods and demons arrayed along the body of the serpent, pulling in opposite directions while Vishnu oversees the operation at the center, and the whole composition conveys a sense of cosmic importance balanced with narrative clarity. It is a scene that rewards prolonged study, the individual figures revealing more and more detail the longer one looks at them. Another significant panel depicts the Battle of Kurukshetra, the climactic conflict at the heart of the great Indian epic known as the Mahabharata, in which two branches of a royal family meet in devastating combat, accompanied by their allies and champions. The carving shows warriors in chariots and on elephants, archers drawing their bows and soldiers falling in the press of battle, all rendered with careful attention to the conventions of Khmer artistic representation. Still other panels depict episodes from the life of Krishna, processions of the Khmer court, representations of heaven and the various hells, and scenes from the Ramayana, another foundational text of Hindu tradition. The carvers who created these works remain anonymous to us, but their skill and dedication are evident in every line and surface. Among the more intriguing aspects of Angkor Wat is its orientation, which differs from that of most other temples in the Angkor region. While the majority of Khmer temples face east-east, toward the rising sun, Angkor Wat faces west, toward the setting sun. And this unusual orientation has prompted considerable scholarly discussion regarding its possible significance. One widely discussed interpretation suggests that the westward orientation may indicate a funerary purpose, since the West was associated in Hindu and Khmer tradition with death and the realm of the ancestors. According to this view, Angkor Wat may have been intended not only as a temple to Vishnu, but also as an eventual mausoleum for Suryavarman II himself, though whether his remains were ever interred, their remains unknown. The westward orientation ensures that the temple is most dramatically illuminated in the afternoon light, when the setting sun warms the sandstone to a golden glow. The astronomical alignments of Angkor Wat have also attracted considerable attention, particularly the behavior of the sun in relation to the central tower at key moments of the year. On the morning of the spring equinox, around the 20th or 21st of March, an observer standing on the western causeway and looking toward the temple will see the sun rise directly over the central tower, creating a moment of perfect alignment between the earthly structure and the celestial body. Similar alignments occur at the autumn equinox and at the solstices, suggesting that the temple's designers had a sophisticated understanding of solar movements and incorporated this knowledge into their architectural planning. These alignments reinforce the temple's cosmic symbolism, connecting the earthly representation of Mount Meru to the actual movements of the heavens. The work of the American scholar Eleanor Manica has shed further light on the possible cosmic significance embedded within Angkor Wat's measurements and proportions. Through careful analysis of the temple's dimensions, Manica has proposed that specific measurements correspond to significant numbers in Hindu cosmological and calendrical systems, including the great cycles of time known as yugas. According to her research, the distances between various architectural elements, when measured in the Khmer unit of the hat, yield values that match the durations of these cosmic time cycles, suggesting that the temple was designed as a kind of architectural cosmogram, encoding sacred measurements within its physical structure. While some scholars have questioned aspects of her methodology, her work has opened new avenues for understanding the depth of symbolic intention that may have guided the temple's creators. And so Angkor Wat stands today, much as it has stood for nearly 900 years. Its towers rising above the forest, its galleries encircling their treasures of carved stone, its moat reflecting the clouds that drift across the Cambodian sky. It has survived the fall of empires and the encroachment of jungle, the coming of Buddhism and the departure of kings, and it continues to draw visitors from around the world who come to marvel at what human hands and human faith were able to create. The stone is weathered now, and some of the carvings have softened with age, but the essential vision of Suryavarman II remains legible in every tower and every gallery. A vision of the cosmos brought down to earth and fixed in stone for all who would come after. The story of Jayavarman VII begins not with triumph, but with patience. For this remarkable ruler spent many years away from the center of Khmer power, perhaps residing in the region of Champa to the east, or in other territories under Khmer influence, waiting through the reigns of other kings while the empire continued its slow rhythms of construction and cultivation and religious observance. The precise details of his early life remain somewhat obscured by the passage of centuries, but we know that he was born into the royal lineage, connected to the great Khmer dynasties through both his father and mother, and that he had reached middle age by the time circumstances would finally call him to the throne. This was not a young man seizing power in the flush of ambition, but rather someone who had lived long enough to develop a particular philosophy about kingship and compassion, about the responsibilities of rulers toward those who suffer, and about the spiritual dimensions of temporal authority. The event that would ultimately bring Jayavarman VII to power was one of the most traumatic in all of Khmer history. A military catastrophe that shook the foundations of the empire and left the great capital of Angkor in ruins. In the year 1177 CE, a Cham fleet sailed up the rivers and waterways that connected the coast to the heartland of the Khmer realm, navigating the Mekong and then the Tundal Sap, approaching the capital from a direction that seems to have caught the Khmer defenders entirely unprepared. The Cham forces, arriving in boats and advancing with considerable military skill, overwhelmed the city and killed the reigning king, whose name was Trivu Vanaditya-Varman. The attackers sacked Angkor, carrying away treasures and captives, leaving behind destruction and disorder of a kind the Khmer had not experienced in generations. For a brief period, the great empire seemed to falter, its center violated, its leadership destroyed, its people thrown into confusion and grief. It was in this context of national emergency that Jayavarman VII emerged as a military leader and eventual savior of his people, gathering forces and mounting a campaign of reconquest that would culminate in a decisive naval battle in 1181 CE. The inscriptions tell us that he drove out the Cham invaders and restored Khmer sovereignty, though the process was neither quick nor simple, and the new king would spend years consolidating his power and dealing with various internal and external challenges. When he finally assumed the full title of king, probably in 1181 CE or shortly thereafter, he was already an older man by the standards of his time, perhaps in his 50s or even 60s, yet he would go on to undertake the most ambitious construction program in the entire history of the Khmer Empire, building on a scale that surpassed even the greatest achievements of his predecessors. The transformation that Jayavarman VII brought to the empire extended far beyond military victory, for he also initiated a profound religious reorientation that would mark a significant departure from centuries of Khmer tradition, where previous rulers had devoted themselves primarily to the Hindu god Shiva, or in some cases to Vishnu. Jayavarman II embraced Mahayana Buddhism as his principal faith, placing the Buddhist teachings at the center of his royal ideology and temple construction. This shift was not entirely without precedent, as Buddhism had been present in Cambodia for many centuries and had enjoyed periods of royal favor, but the scale and intensity of Jayavarman VI's Buddhist devotion represented something new, a comprehensive vision of the Buddhist king as a bodhisattva, an enlightened being who postpones final liberation in order to work for the welfare of all sentient creatures. In the inscriptions commissioned during his reign, the king is portrayed not merely as a devotee of the Buddha, but as a living embodiment of compassion, someone whose very purpose was to relieve the suffering of his subjects through acts of construction, medical care, and spiritual provision. The great capital that Jayavarman VII constructed, known as Angkor Thom, stands today as one of the most impressive walled cities of the ancient world, encompassing an area of approximately 9 square kilometers within its massive laterite walls and broad moat. The walls themselves rise to a height of about 8 meters and extend for roughly 3 kilometers on each side, forming a square that encloses not only temples and palaces, but also the residences and workplaces of a substantial urban population. 5 great gateways pierce these walls, one at each cardinal direction, and a 5th on the eastern side, known as the Victory Gate. And each gateway takes the form of a tower, carved with enormous faces, gazing outward in all 4 directions, so that visitors approaching the city would have encountered these serene and watchful countenances before even entering the urban space. The causeways leading to these gates are lined with rows of giant stone figures, Devas on one side and Asurus on the other, all engaged in the act of pulling on the body of a great serpent, recreating the mythological scene of the churning of the ocean of milk that produces the elixir of immortality. At the very center of Angkor Thom rises the temple known as the Bayon, which served as the state temple of Jayavarman VII and represents perhaps the most distinctive and immediately recognizable monument of all Khmer architecture. Unlike the pyramidal mountain temples of earlier periods, the Bayon presents a somewhat chaotic silhouette of towers clustered together at various heights, each tower carved on all four sides with enormous faces that smile gently down upon the viewer. These faces, numbering approximately 216 across the various towers of the temple, have been the subject of considerable scholarly discussion regarding their identity, with some researchers proposing that they represent Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, who figures prominently in Mahayana Buddhist tradition, while others suggest that they may depict Jayavarman VII himself, or perhaps some combination of both identities. The king merged with the divine figure, whose qualities of mercy and wisdom he sought to embody. The expression on these faces is often described as the smile of Angkor, a particular arrangement of lips and closed eyes that suggests inner peace, benevolent awareness, and perhaps a touch of knowing amusement at the pageant of human existence. The galleries of the Bayon contain extensive bas-relief carvings that differ markedly from those found at earlier temples, such as Angkor Wat, for while the older temple devoted its reliefs primarily to mythological scenes and depictions of gods and demons, the Bayon includes remarkable portrayals of everyday Khmer life. Here one may observe scenes of markets and cooking, of fishing and cockfighting, of armies marching with their elephants and ox carts, of naval battles fought between the Khmer and the Cham on the waters of the Tonle Sap. These images provide modern researchers with invaluable information about the material culture, military practices, and daily activities of the Khmer people, rendered with a naturalism and attention to detail that speaks to the concerns of a Buddhist king who valued the mundane as well as the sacred, who saw the lives of ordinary people as worthy of permanent commemoration in stone. Beyond the Bayon, Jayavarman VII constructed numerous other temples throughout the Angkor region and across the wider empire, each serving particular religious and administrative functions within his Buddhist vision of kingship. The Temple of Ta Prohm, located several kilometers east of Angkor Thom, was dedicated to the king's mother in her guise as Prajnaparamita, the personification of transcendent wisdom in Buddhist philosophy. The Temple of Priya Khan, to the north of Angkor Thom, was dedicated to his father, represented as the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, and this vast complex served not only religious purposes, but also functioned as a Buddhist university where monks studied the sacred texts. Banteay Kdae, another substantial temple in the vicinity, contributed to the dense concentration of Buddhist monuments that transformed the landscape around Angkor during this remarkable period of construction. The inscription at Ta Prohm provides us with extraordinarily detailed information about the resources required to maintain a major Khmer temple, and the numbers recorded there give some sense of the scale at which these institutions operated. According to the text carved in stone at this temple, the establishment required the services of 12,640 people who worked directly in the temple service, performing religious rituals, maintaining the buildings, preparing offerings, and carrying out the countless other tasks necessary for the functioning of such a complex Beyond these direct servants, the inscription lists 66,625 people who worked in the rice fields that supplied the temple with its sustenance, along with 2,740 officials who administered this vast economic enterprise. The temple possessed gold dishes and silver vessels, silks and precious objects of many kinds, and the inscription takes evident pride in cataloguing these possessions, which represented not merely wealth, but also the merit generated through religious patronage. Perhaps the most striking evidence of Jayavarman VII's compassionate vision of kingship comes in the form of his infrastructure projects, which extended far beyond the construction of temples to include facilities designed explicitly for the relief of suffering among his people. The inscriptions tell us that he constructed 102 hospitals throughout the empire, positioned at various points so that the sick might receive treatment regardless of their distance from the capital. These hospitals, known in Sanskrit as Arogyasala, or houses of healing, were staffed by physicians and attendants and supplied with medicines. And while we know relatively little about the specific treatments offered, the very existence of such a network represents an unprecedented royal commitment to public welfare. The inscriptions describe the king's motivation in terms that reflect Buddhist teachings about the universality of suffering, stating that he felt the illnesses of his subjects more acutely than his own bodily pains. For while the suffering of the king touches only one person, the suffering of the people multiplies without measure. Similarly, Jayavarman VIII constructed 121 rest houses along the major roads of the empire, providing shelter and provisions for travelers, merchants, and pilgrims who journeyed from one region to another. These structures, called dharmasalas or houses of Dharma, were spaced at regular intervals along the royal highways, perhaps a day's travel apart, offering weary travelers a place to sleep safely and perhaps receive a meal before continuing their journey. The practical benefits of such facilities for trade and communication were considerable, but the inscriptions frame the construction in religious terms as an act of merit that would benefit both the king and his subjects in this life and future lives. One may imagine how such a network would have transformed the experience of long-distance travel in the Khmer realm, providing security and comfort where previously there had been only the hazards of the road. The influence of women at the court of Jayavarman VIII deserves particular attention, for his wife, Devaraja Devi, and her sister Indra Devi played significant roles in the religious and intellectual life of the reign. Devaraja Devi, who apparently died before the end of her husband's rule, is praised in the inscriptions for her profound Buddhist devotion, her generosity to monks and temples, and her influence in turning the king's heart toward the Dharma. After her death, her sister, Indra Devi, became the king's principal queen, and this learned woman is credited with composing elegant Sanskrit inscriptions and teaching Buddhist philosophy to the ladies of the court. The presence of such educated and devout women at the highest levels of Khmer society reminds us that the religious transformations of this period were not solely the work of the king, but reflected a broader movement within the elite culture of the empire. Among the most evocative objects to survive from the reign of Jayavarman VII is a portrait statue discovered at Angkor Wat, which many scholars believe represents the king himself in a posture of meditation. This figure, carved from sandstone and now housed in a museum, shows an older man seated with legs crossed and hands folded, his eyes closed and his expression peaceful, embodying the Buddhist ideal of the enlightened ruler who has transcended worldly concerns while still working for the benefit of all beings. Whether this statue is truly a portrait in the modern sense, capturing the individual features of the historical king, or whether it represents a more idealized image of royal sanctity, remains a matter of scholarly discussion. But the figure, nonetheless, offers a powerful visual testimony to the Buddhist values that Jayavarman VII sought to embody. Looking upon this face, with its suggestion of inward contemplation and gentle wisdom, one may perhaps begin to understand something of the vision that motivated the extraordinary achievements of this final great builder of the Khmer Empire. Beyond the temples and the great stone monuments, beyond the carved galleries where gods and demons pull eternally at the serpent of creation, there existed a living city of wood and thatch and water, a place where ordinary people went about their daily lives in ways that were at once familiar and wonderfully strange. And we know about this world with a specificity that is quite remarkable for the medieval period, because of a single visitor who came to Angkor at the very end of the 13th century, and who wrote down everything he observed with the careful attention of someone who understood that he was witnessing something extraordinary. His name was Zhou Dewan, and he was a Chinese diplomat who spent approximately 11 months at the Khmer capital between the years 1296 and 1297 of the Common Era, and the account he left behind remains the most vivid and detailed description of daily life in medieval Angkor that has survived to the present day. Zhou Dewan arrived as part of a diplomatic mission sent by the Yuan dynasty, which was then ruled by Kublai Khan's grandson Temur Khan, and his purpose was ostensibly to establish formal relations with the Khmer kingdom and to observe the customs and resources of this distant land. But whatever his official duties may have required, Zhou Dewan was blessed with an observer's temperament, and he noted down not only matters of state importance, but also the small particulars of everyday existence: the foods people ate, the clothes they wore, the houses they lived in, and the manner in which they conducted their business and their pleasures. His account, which is sometimes called The Customs of Cambodia, is written in a plain and practical style, without literary flourishes or philosophical commentary, and this straightforward approach makes it all the more valuable to those who wish to understand how people actually lived in the great city nearly 8 centuries ago. The houses of Angkor, Zhou Dewan tells us, were built of wood and thatch and raised on stilts, and this elevated construction served multiple purposes in the tropical climate of the region. The space beneath the house provided shelter from flooding during the monsoon season, allowed cooling breezes to circulate beneath the living quarters, and offered a shaded area for work and storage during the heat of the day. The grander houses of officials and wealthy merchants rose to several stories in height, and their roofs were covered with tiles rather than palm thatch, and some were quite impressive in their construction, though Zhou Dewan was careful to note that only the royal palace and the temples were permitted to be built of stone. The common people lived in more modest dwellings, single-story structures with thatched roofs, but even these were built on stilts and followed the same basic pattern of construction that the climate had encouraged over many generations. The layout of the city itself was organized around the great temples and the royal palace, with wide thoroughfares connecting the major monuments and smaller lanes branching off into residential neighborhoods. The population of Greater Angkor during this period is estimated by modern scholars to have been somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million people, which would have made it one of the largest urban areas in the world at that time, comparable in scale to cities like Constantinople or Hangzhou. This vast population was supported by the sophisticated water management systems that the Khmer engineers had developed over centuries. the great reservoirs and canals that captured the monsoon rains and distributed water to the surrounding rice fields throughout the year. The city was not a dense concentration of buildings in the manner of European cities, but rather a sprawling network of residential clusters, agricultural land, and temple complexes, all connected by roads and waterways, and all dependent upon the careful management of water resources. The marketplaces of Angkor were busy and productive places, and Zhou de Guan observed something that struck him as quite unusual, which was that all commercial trade was conducted by women. The men, he noted, did not engage in buying and selling at the market stalls, and it was the women who sat behind their goods and negotiated prices and handled the exchange of currency and commodities. This practice was evidently so well established that it occasioned no particular comment among the Khmer themselves. But to Zhou de Guan, coming from a society where commercial activity was predominantly a male occupation, it seemed worthy of special mention. The markets sold a great variety of goods, including cloth and metalwork and ceramics and foodstuffs, and the trade was conducted using Chinese copper coins that had become the common currency throughout much of Southeast Asia, though smaller transactions were sometimes accomplished through simple barter. The cuisine of medieval Angkor centered upon two essential ingredients: fish from the Tonle Sap Lake and rice from the surrounding paddies, and these two foods provided the foundation for the daily diet of both rich and poor. The Tonle Sap was, and remains, one of the most productive freshwater fisheries in the world, and the annual reversal of its flow, which occurs when the swollen Mekong River backs up into the lake during the monsoon season, created ideal conditions for fish breeding and made the waters extraordinarily abundant with life. The people of Angkor caught fish in great quantities and preserved much of their catch through fermentation, creating a pungent fish paste called prehok that remains a fundamental ingredient in Cambodian cooking to this day. Zhou de Guan also mentions a sweetener that was called something like 100-plant honey, which scholars believe refers to palm sugar, the sweet substance extracted from the sap of various palm trees and boiled down into blocks or crystals that could be stored and traded. This palm sugar added sweetness to dishes and beverages and was produced in considerable quantities in the forests surrounding the city. The social customs of the Khmer people included practices that Zhou de Guan found curious and sometimes startling, and among these were the filing of teeth and the widespread use of tattooing. Tooth filing was a coming-of-age ritual in which the front teeth were ground down to a more even and aesthetically pleasing shape, and this practice was performed by specialists who were often Buddhist monks or nuns, and the process was accompanied by appropriate ceremonies and celebrations. Tattooing was extremely common among the men, and Zhou de Guan observed that virtually all adult males bore tattoos on their chests and arms, and sometimes their faces, with the patterns varying according to rank and occupation. And these tattoos were applied using needles dipped in a black ink, and the process was reportedly quite painful. The women, he noted, did not generally receive tattoos, though they decorated their bodies in other ways and were fond of floral perfumes and ornaments. One of the more striking aspects of daily life in Angkor was the practice of public bathing, which took place in the great reservoirs and moats that surrounded the temples and defined the urban landscape. The people bathed frequently, sometimes several times a day in the tropical heat, and they did so without particular concern for privacy in the manner that Zhou de Guan, coming from a more modest cultural tradition, found somewhat remarkable. Men and women would enter the water together, though they maintained a certain distance from one another, and the bathing was accompanied by much socializing and conversation, and the reservoirs served as gathering places where news was exchanged and friendships were maintained. The water itself was considered sacred, having been consecrated by the presence of the temples it surrounded, and the act of bathing was thus both a practical matter of personal hygiene and a spiritual practice of purification. The justice system of medieval Angkor included practices that Zhou de Guan described in some detail, and among these was the trial by ordeal, which was used to determine guilt or innocence in cases where the evidence was uncertain or the accusations were contested. The accused person might be required to hold a piece of red-hot metal in their bare hands, or to retrieve an object from a vessel of boiling oil, and the condition of their hands after a specified period of time would determine whether they were judged guilty or innocent. If the wounds healed cleanly and without infection, the accused was considered innocent. But if the wounds festered or failed to heal properly, this was taken as evidence of guilt. Such practices seem harsh and irrational to modern sensibilities, but they were common throughout the medieval world, in Europe as well as Asia, and they served a social function by providing a mechanism for resolving disputes and reinforcing the authority of the judicial system. The Khmer calendar was marked by numerous festivals and ceremonies, and Zhou de Guan witnessed several of these elaborate celebrations during his time in Angkor. The New Year festival was particularly spectacular, with processions and fireworks and theatrical performances that continued for several days, and the entire population seemed to participate in the festivities with great enthusiasm. The royal procession itself was a sight of considerable magnificence, with the king carried on a golden palanquin beneath golden parasols that indicated his sacred status, and surrounded by attendants bearing fans and standards and musical instruments. The parasols were particularly significant symbols of rank, and the number and color of the parasols that a person was entitled to display indicated their position in the social hierarchy, with the king alone permitted the use of golden parasols held by numerous attendants. The procession included soldiers and musicians and dancers and priests, and the crowds gathered along the route to observe and to receive the blessing of the royal presence. The society of Angkor was stratified in ways that included a significant population of enslaved people, and Zhou de Guan observed that many households possessed slaves who performed domestic work and agricultural labor. The conditions and origins of slavery in Angkor were complex, and people might become enslaved through capture in war, through debt that could not be repaid, or through birth to enslaved parents. And the treatment of enslaved people varied considerably, depending upon the household and the circumstances. Zhou de Guan noted that some enslaved people were treated relatively well, while others suffered harsh conditions, and that the mountain peoples from the highland regions surrounding the lowland kingdom were particularly likely to be found in bondage. This aspect of Khmer society is uncomfortable to contemplate, but it was a feature of most civilizations in the ancient and medieval worlds, and the historical record requires that we acknowledge it as part of the complete picture of life in Angkor. Recent archaeological excavations in the greater Angkor region have revealed much about the industrial activities that supported the city's large population and its extensive trade networks. Researchers have discovered the remains of ceramic kilns, where potters produced the earthenware vessels used for cooking and storage and trade. And these kilns were organized into production centers that suggest a well-developed craft industry. Iron smelting sites have also been identified, where ore was processed and metal was worked into tools and weapons and hardware. And the scale of these operations indicates that metallurgy was an important part of the Angkorian economy. Perhaps most surprising to some scholars was the discovery of evidence for glassworking. including glass beads and ornaments that appear to have been manufactured locally rather than imported from distant trading partners. And this suggests that the Khmer artisans had mastered techniques that were quite sophisticated for the period. The water management infrastructure that made life in Angkor possible extended far beyond the immediately visible temples and reservoirs. And recent studies using remote sensing technology have revealed a vast network of canals and embankments and rice paddies that covered hundreds of square kilometers surrounding the urban core. This engineered landscape represented an enormous investment of labor and planning over many generations, and it allowed the Khmer kingdom to support a population far larger than would otherwise have been possible in a region subject to the extremes of monsoon flooding and dry season drought. The management of this water system must have required a considerable bureaucracy and a high degree of social organization, and the temples themselves, with their great reservoirs, served as the symbolic and practical centers of a civilization built upon the mastery of water. And so we may picture the daily rhythms of life in medieval Angkor. The fishermen setting out on the great lake in the early morning mist. The women arranging their goods in the marketplace as the day begins to warm. The children splashing in the reservoirs while their parents work in the rice paddies. The smoke rising from the ceramic kilns in the industrial quarters. The monks chanting in the temples as the sun reaches its zenith. And the long, slow afternoons when the heat discouraged all but the most necessary activity. It was a life shaped by the rhythm of the monsoons and the demands of rice cultivation, by the obligations of religion and the structures of social hierarchy. And it continued for generation after generation as the great stone temples rose and the kingdom reached its greatest extent. Zhou Daguan saw this world at a particular moment in its long history, and though he could not know it, he was witnessing a civilization that had already passed its peak and would soon enter a period of decline from which it would not recover. But that is a matter for another time. And for now, we may simply appreciate the gift of his careful observations, which allow us to see beyond the monuments and into the lives of the people who built them and lived among them so very long ago. And so we come now to a quieter chapter, though one that speaks to the enduring tensions that sometimes simmered beneath the grand monuments we have been describing. And this is the period that historians sometimes call the Great Defacement, a time when the religious landscape of the Khmer Empire underwent a profound and deliberate transformation, leaving scars upon the stone that remain visible to this day. If one knows where to look and how to read the signs that patient archaeologists have spent decades learning to interpret, following the death of Jayavarman VII, the great Buddhist king, whose building program we discussed at some length in earlier sections, the empire he had constructed with such extraordinary energy began to shift in ways both political and spiritual, and his immediate successors found themselves governing a realm that had been utterly reshaped by his vision, a vision that had placed Mahayana Buddhism at the very center of royal ideology and expressed that centrality through the construction of temples, hospitals, rest houses, and countless images of the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas who populate the Buddhist cosmological imagination. The king who would most dramatically reverse this religious orientation was Jayavarman VIII, who ruled from approximately 1243 to 1295 of the Common Era, a reign of some 52 years that represented one of the longest in Khmer history, though it is remembered less for construction than for systematic destruction, less for what was built than for what was deliberately and methodically unmade across the length and breadth of the empire's sacred landscape. The evidence for this program of religious reversal is written upon the stones themselves, and it is evidence that has been carefully documented by scholars, including the Italian archaeologist Vittorio Raveda, whose meticulous studies of Khmer iconography have mapped the patterns of this iconoclasm with the patience and precision that such sensitive work requires, revealing not random vandalism, but organized and purposeful transformation, conducted according to discernible principles and priorities. At the Bayon, the great temple mountain at the heart of Angkor Wat, which Jayavarman VII had constructed as his state temple, and which featured those enigmatic smiling faces gazing out in all directions. The evidence of religious conversion is particularly striking, for here one may observe how thousands of Buddha images were systematically recarved, their forms altered to become lingas, those smooth cylindrical representations of the god Shiva that had been central to Khmer religious practice before the Buddhist interlude, or else transformed into images of Hindu deities through the addition of new iconographic elements and the removal of distinctively Buddhist features. The process was not always successful in fully erasing the original imagery, and a trained eye can often detect the ghostly traces of what once was, the seated meditation posture still faintly visible beneath the superimposed forms, the proportions slightly awkward, where sculptors had to work within the constraints of pre-existing stone, converting rather than creating anew. The outer galleries of the Bayon, which we have described previously with their narrative reliefs depicting scenes of everyday life and military conflict, were largely spared this transformation, perhaps because their content was primarily historical and secular rather than explicitly religious. But the inner sanctuaries and the small chapels scattered throughout the temple complex show abundant evidence of the conversion program, with Buddha images chiseled away or recarved with varying degrees of skill and thoroughness. At Priya Khan, that sprawling temple complex to the north of Angkor Wat, which Jayavarman VII had dedicated to his father in the guise of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, the defacement is similarly extensive, and here one may walk through long galleries where the walls still show the rectangular scars where Buddhist relief panels once stood, now reduced to blank or crudely resurfaced patches of stone that interrupt the otherwise continuous decorative programs that adorn these sacred spaces. The work of removal was thorough, but not complete, and in certain corners and recesses, one may still find Buddhist imagery that somehow escaped the attention of those charged with carrying out the transformation, whether through oversight, inaccessibility, or perhaps the quiet reluctance of workers who may not have shared the religious fervor of those who commanded them. Ta Prohm, which Jayavarman VII had dedicated to his mother in the guise of the female bodhisattva Prajnaparamita, shows similar patterns of defacement, though this temple is now so embraced by the jungle growth that later centuries allowed to engulf it, that some of the evidence is difficult to observe without careful clearing and conservation work. The strangler figs and silk cotton trees having created their own layer of transformation atop the human alterations that preceded them. At Banteay Kda, a somewhat smaller temple in the Angkor complex that was also constructed during Jayavarman VII's reign, archaeologists have documented numerous examples of Buddha statues that were converted to Hindu imagery, and in some cases, the conversion reveals interesting technical details about how the work was accomplished, with sculptors carefully reworking the meditation posture into standing or dancing poses more appropriate to Hindu iconography, adding multiple arms where Buddhist figures typically showed only two, and replacing the gentle features of enlightened tranquility with the more dramatic expressions associated with certain Hindu deities. The sanctuary at Tanaa, a quieter temple less frequently visited by modern travelers, preserves particularly clear evidence of this systematic defacement, with the central image having been thoroughly reworked and the surrounding decoration showing the characteristic rectangular scars where Buddhist relief panels were methodically removed, leaving an absence that speaks as eloquently as presence might about the intensity of the religious transformation that swept through these sacred precincts. The motivations behind this program of iconoclasm were complex and not purely theological. For religious identity in the Khmer Empire was never entirely separable from political identity, and the restoration of Shaivite Hinduism as the dominant royal cult represented not merely a change in devotional preference, but a realignment of power and patronage that would have had profound implications for the priestly hierarchies, landholdings, and political networks that had grown up around the Buddhist institutions established under Jayavarman VII. The Shaivite restoration may be understood in part as a reassertion of traditional royal ideology, a return to the patterns of divine kingship that had characterized most of Angkorian history before the Buddhist interlude, with the king understood as a manifestation or devotee of Shiva rather than as a bodhisattva working toward the enlightenment of all sentient beings. This restoration would have benefited those Brahmanical priestly families whose influence had perhaps waned during the decades of Buddhist royal patronage, and it would have redirected the flow of resources and prestige toward temples and institutions that maintain the Shaivite traditions, creating new winners and losers in the complex economy of sacred power that characterized Khmer religious life. Yet the transformation was never total, and one of the most poignant aspects of this story is the survival of certain Buddhist images that escaped destruction by being sealed away in chambers that remained unopened for centuries, their existence unsuspected until modern archaeological investigation brought them back to light. In 2001, excavations at Banteay, KDA, uncovered a remarkable cache of Buddha statues that had been deliberately buried, apparently during the period of iconoclasm, and whether this burial represented an act of preservation by Buddhist devotees hoping to protect sacred images from destruction, or an act of desecration by Hindu partisans who chose interment over the more laborious work of complete destruction, remains a matter of scholarly discussion. But the result was the preservation of sculptures that would otherwise have been lost. Similar discoveries at other sites have revealed hidden chambers and sealed deposits containing Buddhist imagery that somehow passed through the period of defacement unscathed, emerging into modern consciousness as evidence of what was lost and what, against considerable odds, managed to survive. The irony of these discoveries is considerable, for the very act of concealment that was perhaps intended to erase these images from religious life actually preserved them more perfectly than open display would have, protecting them from the weathering and gradual deterioration that affected sculptures that remained exposed to the elements and the continuing transformations of subsequent centuries. The patterns of iconoclasm documented by Ravida and other scholars reveal certain consistencies that suggest central direction rather than local improvisation, with the same techniques of removal and conversion appearing across widely separated sites, indicating that the program was organized and supervised according to established protocols rather than left to the discretion of individual temple authorities. Yet within this overall pattern, there were variations and inconsistencies that remind us of the human element in even the most systematically organized programs of religious transformation, with some workers more thorough than others, some sites receiving more intensive attention, while others were perhaps overlooked or given lower priority in the campaign of conversion. The religious situation in the Khmer Empire was never characterized by the kind of absolute boundaries that modern categories sometimes suggest. and even during periods of Hindu dominance, there were Buddhist practitioners and institutions, just as Buddhist periods saw the continuation of Hindu worship and the maintenance of Hindu temples by devoted communities. The concept of religious exclusivism that characterizes some modern traditions was largely foreign to the Southeast Asian context, where syncretism and accommodation were more typical than absolute boundaries. And royal patronage of one tradition did not necessarily require the complete suppression of others, though the period of Jayavarman VII represents a notable exception to this general pattern of tolerance. In later centuries, following the end of Jayavarman VIII's long reign, Buddhism would return to prominence in the Khmer lands, though now in its Theravada form rather than the Mahayana Buddhism that Jayavarman VIII had championed. And this revival was accomplished peacefully, without the systematic defacement that had characterized the Hindu restoration. Theravada Buddhism, spreading from Sri Lanka through mainland Southeast Asia during the 13th and 14th centuries, gradually became the dominant religious tradition of the Khmer people, and it remains so to the present day, with modern Cambodia characterized by the orange-robed monks and the distinctive architecture of the Theravada Wat, or monastery, that have become emblematic of Khmer religious identity. The later Buddhist revival saw the adaptation of older temples to new religious purposes, with Hindu sanctuaries becoming sites of Buddhist worship and the ancient god kings being reinterpreted through Buddhist cosmological frameworks, creating the complex layers of religious history that characterize many of the great temple sites. This process of adaptation represents a parallel phenomenon to the earlier Hindu transformation of Buddhist sites, though accomplished through gradual accommodation rather than systematic defacement, with Buddhist shrines and images added to Hindu temples rather than Hindu imagery being destroyed to make way for Buddhist replacements. The result is the palimpsest-like quality of many Angkorian temples, where one may read multiple layers of religious history superimposed upon the same stones, Hindu foundations supporting Buddhist additions, which may themselves show evidence of later Hindu restoration before subsequent Buddhist revival, each layer preserving traces of those that came before, while adding its own distinctive contributions to the sacred complex. Walking through these temples today, one encounters evidence of all these transformations, from the original construction through the various phases of modification and adaptation that occurred over the centuries. And understanding this complex history adds depth and poignancy to what might otherwise appear as static monuments frozen in ancient time. The defaced Buddha images, the converted sanctuaries, the hidden caches of preserved sculpture, and the later Buddhist additions all speak to the dynamic and sometimes contentious religious history of a civilization that expressed its spiritual aspirations through the medium of stone, medium durable enough to preserve the evidence of transformation that more ephemeral materials would have lost. And so the great temples of the Khmer Empire serve not only as monuments to individual kings or specific religious traditions, but as archives of religious change over time, documents in stone that record the shifting currents of faith and power that flowed through these lands across the centuries, leaving their marks upon the sacred architecture in ways that patient observation and careful scholarship continue to reveal and interpret. As we prepare to move into subsequent sections of our history, we may carry with us this awareness of the layered complexity that characterizes even apparently simple religious monuments, recognizing that what we see today is the product of centuries of construction, modification, destruction, and adaptation, each phase contributing its own chapter to to the continuing story of human spiritual aspiration, expressed through the enduring medium of carved and assembled stone. Resting quietly, now beneath the tropical stars that have watched over these temples since the first foundations were laid in the distant centuries of the Khmer Golden Age. The decline of the Khmer Empire was not a sudden catastrophe, nor was it a single dramatic moment that can be pinpointed on a timeline with any real precision, but rather a gradual, almost imperceptible process that unfolded over many decades, perhaps even centuries, as various pressures, both environmental and political, slowly accumulated until the great capital at Angkor could no longer sustain itself in the manner it had for so many generations before. This is a story not of conquest and defeat in the traditional sense, though there were indeed conquests, but of systems slowly failing, of water no longer flowing where it needed to flow, of rains that did not come when they were needed, and then came far too heavily when they were not wanted at all, and of a world changing around a civilization that had built itself upon assumptions about climate and environment that were proving, century by century, to be less and less reliable. The relationship between Angkor and the emerging Thai kingdoms to the west and north had been complicated for a very long time, with periods of conflict stretching back well before the 14th century, and with cultural exchange flowing in both directions despite the frequent hostilities. The Ayutthaya Kingdom, which had been founded in the mid-14th century in what is now central Thailand, represented a particularly formidable challenge to Khmer power in the region, and the conflicts between these two polities would shape the final chapters of Angkor's history as a functioning imperial capital. In the year 1352, Ayutthayan forces under King Ramathibodi I successfully captured Angkor, though the Khmer would eventually regain control of their capital. And this event marked the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself with exhausting regularity over the following decades. The wars continued with the invasion of 1394, which brought further devastation to the Khmer heartland. And there were other campaigns as well, each one draining resources that might otherwise have been devoted to maintaining the extraordinarily complex infrastructure upon which the entire civilization depended. The constant need to raise armies, to defend territory, to rebuild after raids and sieges, meant that fewer hands and fewer resources were available for the unglamorous, but absolutely essential work of keeping the canals clear, the reservoirs functional, and the sluice gates in proper working order. War is expensive in ways that go far beyond the immediate costs of soldiers and weapons, and for a hydraulic civilization like that of the Khmer, the indirect costs of military conflict were perhaps even more devastating than the battles themselves. The siege of 1431, conducted under the Ayutthayan king Boromiracha II, has traditionally been identified as the moment when Angkor fell, though the reality was considerably more complicated than such a simple narrative suggests. The Thai forces did indeed capture the city, and there does appear to have been significant disruption to the royal court and to the administrative functions that had been centered at Angkor for so many centuries. The Khmer king, whoever he may have been at that moment as the records are somewhat unclear, eventually relocated the capital away from Angkor, first to various sites and eventually to Phnom Penh, which sat at the confluence of the Mekong and Tonle Sap rivers, and offered better access to the maritime trade routes that were becoming increasingly important in the regional economy. Later still, the capital would move to Luvik, another site better positioned for the emerging patterns of commerce and politics that characterized the 15th and 16th centuries in mainland Southeast Asia. These relocations were not simply strategic withdrawals forced by military defeat, though defeat certainly played a role, but also represented a recognition that the world had changed, that the advantages which had once made Angkor such an ideal location for an imperial capital no longer applied in quite the same way, and that the future of the Khmer kingdom lay elsewhere, in places more suited to the new economic and political realities of the region. But to understand why Angkor could not simply recover from the Thai attacks as it had recovered from conflicts in earlier centuries, we must look beyond the immediate military history to the environmental changes that were fundamentally undermining the physical basis of the civilization. In the year 2010, the researcher Brendan Buckley and his colleagues published findings from their dendrochronological studies of ancient cypress trees in Vietnam and Thailand, and what they discovered provided remarkable new insights into the climate history of the region during the centuries when Angkor was in decline. Dendrochronology, which is the scientific study of tree rings and the information they contain about past environmental conditions, allows researchers to reconstruct patterns of rainfall and drought going back many hundreds of years with considerable precision. And the picture that emerged from Buckley's research was one of extraordinary climatic instability during the 14th and 15th centuries. The tree ring data revealed that the decades leading up to and following the fall of Angkor were marked by severe and prolonged droughts, the kind of multi-year periods of insufficient rainfall that would have placed enormous stress on any agricultural system, but which would have been particularly devastating for a civilization so utterly dependent on stored water and carefully managed irrigation. These droughts were not brief interruptions in an otherwise stable pattern, but rather extended periods lasting years at a time, during which the great reservoirs would have gradually emptied, the crops would have failed, and the elaborate system of channels and waterways would have begun to deteriorate from disuse and neglect. The labor that might have been devoted to maintaining these systems was instead required simply for survival, for finding food and water in a landscape that was no longer providing them in the quantities to which the population had become accustomed. But the droughts were not the only climatic challenge revealed by the dendrochronological record. The tree ring evidence also showed that these extended dry periods were followed by unusually intense monsoon seasons, with rainfall far exceeding the normal patterns, and this combination proved absolutely devastating for the hydraulic infrastructure of Angkor. A water management system that has been neglected during years of drought is poorly prepared to handle sudden extreme flooding, and the monsoons that came after the dry periods appear to have overwhelmed the already weakened infrastructure in catastrophic ways. Channels that had silted up during the dry years were unable to carry the floodwaters away efficiently, while sluice gates and other control structures that had not been properly maintained failed under the pressure of flows they were no longer designed to handle. The physical evidence of this infrastructure collapse has been studied by archaeologists and hydrologists working at Angkor, and what they have found supports the picture painted by the tree ring data. Channels that once carried water precisely where it was needed became clogged with sediment, their carefully engineered gradients disrupted by years of neglect, and then by the violent floods that reshaped the landscape. The great reservoirs, which had been maintained over centuries by the labor of countless workers, gradually lost their capacity to store water effectively as their carefully designed features were damaged and their connections to the broader water system were severed. The sluice gates, those marvels of medieval engineering that had allowed the Khmer to control the flow of water with such precision, fell into disrepair and eventually ceased to function as intended, becoming obstacles rather than tools, blockages rather than control points. It is worth pausing to appreciate just how difficult it would have been to repair such damage once it had accumulated beyond a certain point. The water management system of Angkor was not a collection of independent components that could be fixed one at a time, but rather an integrated network in which each element depended upon the proper functioning of many others. A silted channel could not simply be dredged without consideration for where the removed sediment would go, and how the flow of water upstream and downstream would be affected. A broken sluice gate could not be repaired without first managing the water that would rush through the opening, which required other gates and channels to be functioning properly. The system had been built up over centuries by engineers who understood its complexities intimately, and once that knowledge began to be lost, once the institutional capacity to maintain and repair the infrastructure began to decay, the damage became self-reinforcing and increasingly irreversible. The military conflicts with Ayutthaya and other regional powers must be understood in this context. It was not simply that the Thai armies were stronger than those of the Khmer, though the balance of power had certainly shifted over time, but that the Khmer state no longer had the resources to simultaneously defend itself against external threats and maintain the internal infrastructure upon which its survival depended. Each war diverted labor and resources away from the canals and reservoirs. Each siege disrupted the agricultural cycles upon which the food supply depended, and each period of recovery was cut short by the next conflict before the damage could be fully repaired. The droughts made the kingdom weaker, which made it more vulnerable to attack, which made it harder to recover from the droughts, in a vicious cycle that eventually proved impossible to escape. There were other factors as well, including the shifting patterns of regional trade that increasingly favored coastal cities over inland capitals like Angkor. The maritime trade routes connecting China to India and beyond had grown enormously in importance during the centuries of Angkor's dominance, and while the Khmer had participated in this trade, their capital was not ideally situated to take full advantage of it. Phnom Penh, by contrast, sat at one of the great crossroads of Southeast Asian river commerce, where the Mekong met the Tandli Sap in a confluence that provided access to vast regions of the interior, while also connecting to the sea routes that linked the region to the wider world. As trade became an increasingly important source of wealth and power, the strategic advantages of Angkor gradually diminished, while those of coastal and riverine cities grew correspondingly. The relocation of the capital was therefore not merely a retreat, but also an adaptation, a recognition that the future lay in different kinds of connections and different kinds of wealth than those which had sustained Angkor during its centuries of glory. The kings who moved their courts to Phnom Penh and Lovek were not abandoning Khmer civilization, but rather repositioning it for survival in a changed world, even if this meant leaving behind the great temple complexes and the vast reservoir systems that had defined their predecessors' achievements. This was a painful transition, certainly, and it involved real losses, both material and symbolic, but it was also a rational response to circumstances that had made the old ways of doing things no longer viable. It is important to understand, however, that Angkor was never truly lost in the sense that romantic 19th century accounts sometimes suggested. The idea of a great civilization swallowed by the jungle, forgotten for centuries until rediscovered by European explorers, is a compelling narrative, but not an accurate one. In reality, Angkor continued to be inhabited, visited, and venerated throughout the centuries following the relocation of the capital, even if the population was much reduced from the hundreds of thousands who had once lived within and around the great urban complex. The temples, particularly Angkor Wat itself, continued to function as places of worship and pilgrimage, and they were never entirely abandoned or forgotten by the Khmer people. The Portuguese visitors who reached Cambodia in the 16th century recorded the existence of Angkor and described it in terms that make clear it was a known and visited site, not a hidden mystery waiting to be discovered. These European travelers were not the first outsiders to see the temples since their abandonment, but simply the first Europeans to record their impressions in documents that survive to the present day. The site was part of the living memory, an ongoing religious practice of the Khmer kingdom, not a relic of a forgotten past. Perhaps the most charming evidence of Angkor's continued importance comes from the Japanese pilgrim inscriptions that can still be seen at Angkor Wat, dating from the 1630s and the decades surrounding that period. Japanese Buddhists, traveling the maritime routes that connected their homeland to the trading ports of Southeast Asia, made their way to Angkor Wat and left inscriptions recording their visits, much as pilgrims have done at sacred sites throughout history. One inscription records the visitor's impression of the temple and his religious devotion, while others simply note names and dates in the manner of visitors' books throughout the ages. These inscriptions demonstrate that Angkor Wat was known far beyond the borders of Cambodia, that it drew visitors from across the Buddhist world, and that it remained a functioning religious site even as the political center of the Khmer kingdom had long since moved elsewhere. The Khmer Chronicles, those records kept by the royal courts and religious establishments of later centuries, also document ongoing royal visits to Angkor. Kings would make pilgrimages to the great temples of their ancestors, performing rituals and making offerings at sites that remained sacred even if they were no longer the center of political power. These visits served to maintain connections between the present and the past, to assert continuity with the great civilization that had built the temples, and to reaffirm the legitimacy of royal lines that traced their ancestry back to the god-kings of Angkor. The temples were not abandoned monuments, but rather active participants in the religious and political life of the later Khmer kingdom, even if their role had changed dramatically from what it had once been. The transformation of Angkor from imperial capital to pilgrimage site was gradual and complex, and it did not happen all at once or according to any single timeline. Some areas were abandoned relatively quickly after the relocations of the 15th century, while others continued to be inhabited and maintained for generations longer. The great reservoirs, no longer functional as water storage systems, gradually became features of the landscape rather than tools of civilization, while the temples continued to be used for worship even as the surrounding urban areas fell into decay. The jungle did gradually encroach upon the ruins, particularly in the areas that were least visited and least maintained. But this was a slow process spanning centuries rather than a sudden swallowing of the city by the forest. What we see at Angkor today is the product of this long transformation, of centuries during which some structures were maintained while others were neglected, during which pilgrims and monks kept certain areas clear while allowing others to be reclaimed by the trees. The famous images of temples wrapped in the roots of giant strangler figs represent only one part of this story, the part that captures the imagination most vividly. But they do not represent the whole of what happened to Angkor after the capital moved away. Much of the site remained known and visited, if not intensively maintained, throughout the centuries between the 15th and the 19th, and the rediscovery of Angkor by European explorers was less a revelation of something hidden than a reintroduction of something well known to Cambodians to a wider global audience that had never heard of it. The slow collapse of Angkor was therefore not an ending, but a transformation. Not a disappearance, but a change in the role and significance of a place that had been central to one of the great civilizations of medieval Asia. The combination of climate change, infrastructure failure, military pressure, and shifting trade routes that brought this transformation about was complex and gradual, unfolding over many decades, if not centuries, and leaving behind not a sudden ruin, but a landscape of temples and reservoirs that continued to hold meaning for the people who had built them long after the capital had moved elsewhere. This is perhaps not as dramatic a story as the romantic narrative of a lost city swallowed by the jungle, but it is a more accurate one, and in its own quiet way, it is a story worth knowing. A reminder of how civilizations change and adapt and persist, even when the circumstances that gave rise to them have fundamentally altered. In the year 1860, a French naturalist named Henri Mouhot found himself traveling through the forests of Cambodia, ostensibly in search of botanical specimens and exotic insects for European collectors, though his journey would come to be remembered for something far larger than any butterfly or orchid he might have pressed between the pages of his notebooks. Mouhot had set out from Bangkok some months earlier, making his way slowly through the countryside with the assistance of local guides who knew the paths and waterways intimately. And it was these same guides, men whose families had lived in the region for generations, who led him eventually to the great stone temples that rose from the jungle near the shores of the Tonle Sap Lake. When Mouhot first glimpsed the towers of Angkor Wat emerging from the trees, he recorded his impressions in the journals. He kept faithfully throughout his travels, writing with a mixture of wonder and scholarly curiosity about the vast monuments he encountered, structures so immense and so elaborately carved that he struggled to find adequate words in French to convey their scale and beauty to readers who had never seen anything quite like them. It is worth pausing here, as we settle into this particular chapter of Angkor's long story, to note that Mouhot himself never claimed to have discovered these temples in any meaningful sense, for he was quite clear in his writings that the local Cambodian people knew perfectly well where the ruins lay and what they represented. The monks who maintained small shrines within certain temple precincts, the farmers who cultivated rice in the shadow of ancient reservoirs, the fishermen who plied the waters nearby, all of these people had their own relationships with the stones that predated Mouhot's arrival by many centuries, and he acknowledged as much in his journals. What Mouhot did accomplish, however, was something rather different, for his writings, published posthumously in France after he died of fever in Laos in 1861, captured the imagination of European readers in a way that earlier accounts had somehow failed to do. His descriptions were vivid and accessible, accompanied by sketches he had made on site, and they appeared at precisely the moment when European audiences were hungry for tales of exotic lands and ancient mysteries waiting to be explored. The characterization of Mouhot's journey as a discovery says more about European attitudes of the 19th century than it does about the temples themselves, which had never truly been lost or forgotten by anyone except those who lived very far away. If we trace backwards through the historical record, we find that European visitors had in fact encountered Angkor long before Mouhot ever packed his bags for Southeast Asia. In 1586, nearly 3 centuries earlier, a Portuguese friar named Antonio da Madalena traveled to Cambodia and spent some time at the court there, eventually visiting the ruins of Angkor and describing what he saw in terms that suggest genuine astonishment at their grandeur. His account, preserved in the writings of the historian Diogo do Couto, speaks of a city of extraordinary size and magnificence, though Madalena seemed uncertain about who might have built such a place or when. In the 17th century, French missionaries and merchants also made their way to the region and left scattered references to the ancient temples in their letters and reports. Though these documents circulated only among specialists and colonial administrators, rather than reaching the broader reading public, perhaps more significantly, Thai royal maps and administrative documents from the 18th and 19th centuries clearly marked the location of Angkor and acknowledged its historical importance. For the Thai kingdoms had long been aware of the Khmer legacy that lay within territories they sometimes controlled. When Mouhot arrived with his guides, he was not penetrating unknown wilderness, but rather traveling through a landscape that had been continuously inhabited and continuously remembered, even if that memory took different forms among different peoples. The jungle had grown thick over many of the structures, certainly, and the vines and roots had worked their way into the stonework over the centuries. But the knowledge of what lay beneath those leaves had never entirely vanished. It had simply resided in places and among people that European scholars had not thought to consult, or had not considered authoritative sources of historical knowledge. Nevertheless, the publication of Mouhot's journals in 1863, first in serial form, and then as a book that was translated into several languages, sparked what can only be described as an Angkor enthusiasm across educated Europe. Readers were fascinated by the notion of a great civilization hidden in the jungle, its monuments rivaling or even surpassing those of ancient Greece and Rome, and expeditions began to be organized with the explicit purpose of documenting and studying what Mouhot had described. The French government, which had by this time established colonial interests in the region through its control of Cochinchina in the south of present-day Vietnam, saw both scientific and political value in claiming a kind of custodianship over this newly celebrated heritage. Cambodia itself had become a French protectorate in 1863, the same year Mouhot's journals appeared, though the timing was largely coincidental. And over the following decades, the colonial administration took an increasingly active role in managing the ancient sites. One of the more energetic figures in this early period of French engagement with Angkor was Louis Delaporte, a naval officer who participated in an exploratory expedition along the Mekong River in the late 1860s, and who became deeply devoted to the study and preservation of Khmer art. Delaporte returned to Cambodia multiple times in the 1870s, not merely to document what he found, but to collect it, arranging for the removal of sculptures, carved lintels, and architectural fragments that he believed would be better appreciated and better cared for in France than in the tropical forests where they had stood for centuries. He also commissioned the creation of plaster casts, careful reproductions of reliefs and decorative elements that could be shipped back to Paris without further depleting the original sites, and these casts eventually formed the core of a Khmer collection at the Trocadero Museum, allowing French citizens to encounter something of Angkor's artistry without making the long sea voyage themselves. The ethics of such removals would be debated in later generations, with some arguing that Delaporte had preserved objects that might otherwise have been lost to decay or looting, and others contending that he had simply engaged in a more officially sanctioned form of the same plunder he claimed to be preventing. As French colonial control over the region solidified in the final decades of the 19th century, the study of Angkor became increasingly institutionalized. In 1898, the colonial administration established the École Française d'Extrême Orient, an organization dedicated to the scholarly investigation of Asian history, archaeology, languages, and culture, with particular attention to the territories under French influence. The EFEOO, as it came to be known by its French initials, would become the primary body responsible for research and conservation at Angkor for many decades, sending generations of archaeologists, epigraphers, architects, and art historians to live and work among the temples. These scholars produced detailed surveys, translated the Sanskrit and Khmer inscriptions carved into doorposts and stales, mapped the hydraulic systems that had once sustained the city, and gradually assembled a coherent understanding of Khmer chronology and kingship that had not existed in Western scholarship before. Their work was painstaking and often tedious, involving long hours of copying worn inscriptions by hand, or measuring the precise angles of eroded stones. But it laid the foundation for nearly everything we now know about the ancient Khmer Empire. The question of how to treat the physical structures themselves proved contentious from the beginning. When scholars and administrators first turned their attention to Angkor in earnest, the temples were in varying states of preservation, some still relatively intact, others little more than tumbled heaps of sandstone blocks, half buried beneath centuries of fallen leaves and encroaching vegetation. The jungle had embraced the ruins with a kind of patient ferocity, sending roots down through gaps in the masonry and pushing trees up through galleries and courtyards. And deciding what to do about this intertwining of nature and architecture required making difficult choices about what kind of Angkor the world wished to see. One approach, known by the Dutch term anastylosis, involved carefully dismantling collapsed or unstable sections, cataloguing each stone, and then reassembling them in their original positions using the original materials wherever possible, adding new elements only when absolutely necessary for structural integrity. This method had been developed and refined by Dutch archaeologists working at Borobudur in Java, and French conservators eventually adopted it at Angkor after some initial hesitation, finding that it allowed them to restore something of the temple's original appearance without introducing too much modern material into the ancient fabric. Not everyone agreed that this was the proper course. Some argued that the temples should simply be stabilized and preserved in whatever state they had reached, that the picturesque decay was itself part of their character and history, and that attempting to reconstruct fallen towers or replace missing sculptures was a form of falsification that confused modern intervention with ancient intention. Others worried that anastylosis, however carefully executed, inevitably involved interpretive choices about what the original had looked like, choices that might be wrong, and that would be difficult to reverse once the stones had been cemented back into place. These debates continued throughout the 20th century and have never been entirely resolved, for they touch on fundamental questions about the purpose of archaeological sites, whether we preserve them primarily as documents of the past, as aesthetic experiences in the present, or as something in between that serves both functions imperfectly. In the early 1900s, the practical work of clearing vegetation and stabilizing structures fell largely to a man named Jean Khmer, who served as the first conservator of Angkor under the EFEO's auspices. Khmer devoted years of his life to the slow, laborious process of cutting back the jungle that had swallowed so many of the monuments, revealing carved surfaces that had not seen direct sunlight in generations, and making it possible for visitors to walk through galleries and climb staircases that had long been impassable. He was by all accounts a dedicated and methodical man, more comfortable among the stones than in the drawing rooms of Phnom Penh or Saigon, and he lived simply in a house near the temples themselves. In 1916, while traveling along a road not far from Angkor, Khmer was attacked and killed by bandits. His death a reminder that the region remained in many ways beyond the full control of the colonial authorities who claimed it. He was buried near the temples he had worked so hard to preserve, and his successors continued the efforts he had begun, gradually expanding the areas that could be visited and studied. The French administration also concerned itself with making Angkor accessible to tourists, recognizing that the temples held considerable appeal for travelers seeking the exotic and the ancient. Two principal routes were established for visitors, one known as the Grand Circuit and the other as the Petite Circuit, each designed to lead tourists past a selection of the most impressive monuments in a logical sequence that could be completed in a day or two. The Petite Circuit concentrated on the central temples, including Angkor Wat and the Bayon, while the Grand Circuit extended to more distant sites like Preah Khan and the artificial lake of Neak Pean, allowing those with more time to gain a broader sense of the ancient city's extent. These itineraries, created in the early 20th century, remained largely unchanged for decades and shaped the way countless visitors experienced Angkor, their footsteps following paths laid out by French planners a century ago. The territorial politics of the region also intersected with the fate of the temples in complicated ways. When the French established their protectorate over Cambodia in 1863, the provinces containing Angkor and much of the old Khmer heartland were actually under Thai control, having been ceded to Siam in earlier conflicts. For several decades, the temples that had become so famous through Mouhot's writings lay outside the boundaries of French-administered Cambodia, a situation that struck many French officials as both historically anomalous and politically inconvenient. In 1907, after extended negotiations, Thailand agreed to return the provinces of Siem Reap, Battambang, and Sisophon to Cambodia, bringing Angkor at last within the territory governed from Phnom Penh under French supervision. This transfer was accomplished through diplomatic pressure and the threat of further French expansion, and it has remained a point of some sensitivity in Thai-Cambodian relations ever since, a reminder that the lines on maps often reflect the balance of power at particular moments, rather than any timeless natural boundaries. With the temples now firmly within their administrative grasp, the French invested considerable resources in their study and presentation, and Angkor became one of the jewels of French colonial heritage, a testament to the civilizing mission that justified imperial presence in the minds of those who believed in such things. The work of the EFEO continued through the upheavals of the First and Second World Wars, through the Japanese occupation of Indochina, and into the period of Cambodian independence in 1953, when the French gradually withdrew from their former protectorate, but left behind a legacy of archaeological method and institutional knowledge that would shape conservation efforts for generations to come. And so we arrive now at a more recent and rather more somber chapter in the long story of Angkor, a period that unfolded not across the slow centuries of empire and eclipse, but within the span of a few difficult decades, when the ancient temples found themselves standing witness to some of the most turbulent and painful years in all of Cambodian history. It is a chapter that one might expect to be defined by destruction and loss, and indeed there were losses, some of them grievous and irreversible, but there is also within this story a certain unexpected resilience, a survival that speaks to the strange ways in which even the most devastating human conflicts can sometimes spare what we might least expect to endure. The year 1975 marked the beginning of what would become one of the most harrowing periods in modern Southeast Asian history, when the forces known as the Khmer Rouge, under the leadership of a man who had taken the nom de guerre Pol Pot, swept into Phnom Penh and began their radical and ultimately catastrophic experiment in social transformation. The cities were emptied, the population driven into the countryside, and over the next 4 years, a tragedy of almost incomprehensible proportions unfolded across the land, claiming the lives of somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people through execution, starvation, disease, and exhaustion. One might reasonably assume that such a regime, so dedicated to the erasure of the old world and the creation of a revolutionary year, zero, would have shown no mercy to the ancient temples, those monuments to divine kingship and Buddhist devotion that seemed to represent everything the revolution claimed to oppose. And yet, somewhat paradoxically, the temples of Angkor emerged from the Khmer Rouge period with surprisingly minimal direct structural damage, their towers still rising above the forest, their galleries still intact, their causeways still stretching across the remnants of the ancient reservoirs. The reasons for this unexpected preservation lie in the complex and often contradictory nature of the Khmer Rouge ideology itself, which, despite its nominal rejection of religion and its brutal persecution of Buddhist monks, nevertheless embraced a fierce nationalism that found in the temples of Angkor a useful symbol of Khmer greatness and historical achievement. Pol Pot himself, who had visited the temples in his youth and had developed what appears to have been a genuine, if somewhat peculiar reverence for them, viewed Angkor not as a monument to the feudal past that must be destroyed, but rather as proof of what the Khmer people could accomplish when properly unified and directed, a precedent for the great collective achievements he imagined his revolution would produce. This nationalist appropriation of Angkor meant that the temples themselves were largely spared from deliberate destruction, even as Buddhist statues elsewhere in the country were being smashed and monasteries were being converted into prisons or simply demolished. The regime even organized visits to Angkor for foreign delegations, using the ancient monuments as evidence of Khmer civilization and capability. Though, of course, the grinding reality of what was happening in the countryside was carefully kept from such visitors, there were certainly acts of vandalism and damage during this period, some of it incidental to the general chaos, some of it perhaps ideologically motivated by lower-level cadres who did not share or did not understand the leadership's selective preservation of the temples. But there was no systematic campaign of destruction of the kind that reduced so much other Cambodian cultural heritage to rubble. The real threat to the temples during the long years of conflict that stretched from the early 1970s through to the late 1980s came not from deliberate destruction, but from something rather more insidious: the gradual and ongoing theft of their sculptures, their carved reliefs, their decorative elements, and their sacred images. Looting had always occurred at Angkor to some degree, ever since the temples had first been rediscovered by outsiders in the 19th century, but the chaos of war and the collapse of central authority created conditions in which this theft could occur on an industrial scale, with organized networks stripping temples of their portable treasures and funneling them across the border to markets in Thailand and beyond, where they would eventually find their way into private collections and even into the holdings of major museums in Europe, America, and Japan. The process was often brutal in its efficiency and its indifference to the aesthetic and historical integrity of what was being taken. Buddha heads were severed from their bodies with hacksaws and chisels, leaving the decapitated torsos still seated in meditation along the temple galleries. Bas-relief fragments were cut from walls, the looters carving out sections of narrative friezes that had survived 8 or 9 centuries, only to be dismembered for sale. At Banti Shma, that great and somewhat remote temple complex in the northwestern provinces. Entire sections of the famous bas-reliefs depicting Lokeshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, were prized from the walls by organized gangs working under cover of the ongoing conflict. The heavy stones loaded onto trucks and driven across the border, where some were eventually intercepted by Thai authorities, while others disappeared into the labyrinthine channels of the international art market. The Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in late 1978, which brought an end to the Khmer Rouge regime in January of 1979, did not immediately improve the situation at Angkor, but the subsequent decade was marked by continued instability, ongoing guerrilla warfare, international isolation, and the presence of landmines scattered liberally across the landscape by the various warring factions. The People's Republic of Kampuchea, as the Vietnamese-backed government styled itself, exercised only limited control over the remote areas where many temples stood, and the combination of poverty, continued conflict, and lack of international oversight meant that looting continued largely unabated. The temples that had survived the Khmer Rouge now found themselves in a kind of dangerous limbo, protected in theory, but vulnerable in practice, their guardians too few and too poorly equipped to prevent the ongoing hemorrhage of their treasures. It was during this period, and in the years that followed, the Paris Peace Accords of 1991, which brought an end to the various conflicts and paved the way for United Nations supervised elections, that some of the most notorious thefts occurred. In 1993, a sculptural head widely believed to represent King Jayavarman VII, that great ruler whose face gazes down from the towers of the Bayon, was stolen from a temple in the Angkor complex. This particular head, with its characteristic serene expression and gently closed eyes, had been one of the most celebrated individual pieces at the site, and its disappearance sent ripples of alarm through the international community of scholars and conservators who had begun to hope that the end of conflict might also mean the end of the systematic plunder. The theft of the Jayavarman head was far from an isolated incident. At Prasakravan, that small but beautiful temple dedicated to Vishnu and notable for its rare brick bas-reliefs of the god and his consort Lakshmi, investigators found the unmistakable marks of chainsaws on the ancient brickwork where looters had attempted to cut away sections of the carved reliefs. The mechanical precision of these cuts, so different from the chisel marks of earlier, more artisanal theft, spoke to a new level of brazenness and sophistication in the looting networks, an industrialization of cultural destruction that was deeply troubling to those who understood its implications. Similar marks were found at other temples, evidence of a systematic campaign that viewed these ancient monuments merely as quarries to be mined for saleable commodities. The international recognition of the crisis at Angkor came in 1992, when the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, inscribed the Angkor Archaeological Park on the World Heritage List, a designation that brought both symbolic weight and practical resources to the task of protection and preservation. The inscription was accompanied by simultaneous placement on the list of World Heritage in danger, an acknowledgement that the threats facing the temples were severe and immediate, requiring urgent international attention and coordination. This dual listing, a somewhat unusual step, reflected the delicate balance between celebrating Angkor's outstanding universal value and confronting honestly the very real dangers it still faced. In response to this recognition, the Cambodian government established in 1995 the Authority for the Protection and Management of Angkor and the region of Siem Reap, known by its French acronym APSARA, which became the primary national body responsible for the safeguarding, management, and sustainable development of the Angkor region. APSARA took on the enormous task of creating a coherent administrative framework for a vast archaeological landscape that had for decades been subject to the vagaries of war, the pressures of poverty, and the depredations of the international antiquities market. It was and remains an undertaking of considerable complexity, balancing the needs of conservation with those of tourism, community development, scholarly research, and national heritage. The establishment of APSARA coincided with and facilitated a remarkable multinational effort to restore and conserve the temples, bringing together expertise and resources from around the world in a collaborative endeavor that continues to this day. Japanese teams, working under the auspices of the Japanese government team for safeguarding Angkor, have undertaken extensive work at the Bayon, that enigmatic temple of the stone faces, carefully documenting, stabilizing, and restoring the complex architectural assemblage that centuries of tropical weather and vegetative intrusion had brought to the edge of structural failure. German conservators have focused their attention on Angkor Wat itself, applying their considerable expertise to the preservation of the bas-reliefs and the stabilization of the galleries, working with a methodical precision that mirrors the careful craftsmanship of the original Khmer builders. At Tar Prom, that romantic ruin so famous for its dramatic entanglement with the roots of silk cotton and strangler fig trees, Indian archaeological teams have taken the lead in a delicate conservation effort that seeks to balance structural preservation with the retention of the picturesque quality that has made the temple one of the most beloved sites in all of Angkor. It is a challenging brief, for the very trees that give Tar Prom its distinctive character are also in some places the only thing holding the ancient stones together, their roots having infiltrated the masonry so thoroughly over the centuries that their removal would cause more damage than their retention. The Indian conservators, drawing on their own long experience with the tropical archaeology of the subcontinent, have approached this paradox with admirable sensitivity and technical skill. Before much of this work could proceed, however, it was first necessary to address another, more immediately dangerous legacy of the years of conflict. The forests and fields around the temples were strewn with landmines, unexploded ordnance, and other remnants of war that made access hazardous and sometimes deadly. Organizations such as the Halo Trust undertook the painstaking and perilous work of clearing these hidden dangers from the temple perimeters, their demeanors working methodically through the undergrowth with metal detectors and probes, marking and destroying the devices that had lain in wait for decades. It is work that continues even now in some areas, a grim reminder of how recently these ancient stones were caught up in modern warfare. In the years 2019 and 2020, a rather different kind of exposure occurred, one that shed harsh light on the ways in which stolen Cambodian antiquities had found their way into some of the most respected collections in the world. The death and subsequent investigation of Douglas Latchford, a British collector and dealer who had for decades presented himself as a scholar and benefactor of Khmer art, revealed a trafficking network of remarkable scope and audacity. Latchford, it emerged, had been deeply involved in the acquisition and sale of looted Cambodian antiquities, using his scholarly credentials and his extensive contacts in the museum world to launder stolen objects and place them in collections where their dubious provenance would be obscured by the passage of time and the prestige of their new institutional homes. The Latchford investigation, aided by his own detailed records, which were discovered after his death, prompted a wave of repatriations as museums in America and elsewhere found themselves confronted with evidence that pieces in their collections had been stolen from Cambodian temples and sold through his network. It was a reckoning that exposed uncomfortable truths about the international art market and the complicity, whether willful or negligent, of major cultural institutions in the dispersal of Cambodian heritage. Statues that had stood in galleries in New York and Denver and other cities began to make their way back to Cambodia, a slow and partial reversal of the losses sustained during the long years of conflict and chaos. And so the temples of Angkor, having survived the wars and the looting and the long isolation, have entered a new phase in their existence, one characterized by international cooperation, professional conservation, and a growing recognition that these monuments belong not merely to Cambodia, but to all of humanity. It is not a story with a neat conclusion, for the work of preservation is never truly finished, and the scars left by the years of conflict remain visible in the severed necks of headless Buddhas and the empty niches where sacred images once stood. But it is, perhaps, a story that offers some measure of reassurance, some gentle evidence that even the most turbulent chapters eventually give way to calmer times, that what has been broken can sometimes be mended, and that the great stone temples built so long ago by those ancient Khmer kings continue to stand, patient and enduring, beneath the soft tropical sky. In the year 2012, a small aircraft flew low and slow across the jungle canopy of northwestern Cambodia, carrying equipment that would quietly transform everything archaeologists thought they understood about the Khmer Empire. Mounted beneath the plane was a LIDAR sensor, which stands for light detection and ranging, a device that fires millions of laser pulses toward the ground each second and measures precisely how long each pulse takes to return. The jungle below appeared impenetrable from above, a dense green blanket of dipterocarp trees and strangler figs that had grown undisturbed for centuries. But the laser pulses found their way through tiny gaps in the foliage, slipping between leaves and branches to reach the forest floor itself. And when scientists processed the returning signals, they could strip away the vegetation digitally and reveal the bare earth beneath. The team was led by Damien Evans, an Australian archaeologist who had spent years studying Angkor through more traditional methods, walking through the forest and cutting transects and relying on satellite imagery that could only show what grew on the surface. He had suspected there was more to find, that the known temples represented only a fraction of a much larger urban landscape. But even he could not have anticipated what the data would show when it finally appeared on his screens. The first survey covered approximately 370 square kilometers, focusing on areas around the famous temples of Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom, as well as the more remote mountain of Phnom Kulen, some 40 kilometers to the north. When the vegetation was digitally removed and the ground surface rendered in high resolution, what emerged was not wilderness, but infrastructure. Not untouched forest, but the ghostly outlines of a vast and carefully planned urban system. Around the great temples, the data revealed block after block of residential mounds arranged in orderly grids, connected by roads that ran straight as ruler lines, bordered by channels that once carried water through every neighborhood. There were ponds at regular intervals, spaced so that no household would be far from water during the dry season, and earthen embankments that divided the city into districts and quarters. The forest had grown over all of it, and the ground had settled and softened over 8 centuries of monsoons. But the basic geometry remained legible to the lasers. A palimpsest of human intention written in subtle variations of elevation. At Phnom Kulen, the sacred mountain where Jayavarman II is said to have declared himself a universal monarch in the early 9th century, the discoveries were even more startling. Hidden beneath the forest was an entire city covering approximately 35 square kilometers, making it comparable in size to medieval London or Angkor Wat itself. This was Mahendra Parvata, a name known from inscriptions but never located on the ground, the first great capital of the unified Khmer Empire. The city's design was unlike anything seen at lowland Angkor, adapted instead to the contours of the mountain plateau, with temples arranged in a distinctive spiral pattern that seemed to follow the topography while still conforming to sacred geometric principles. There were reservoirs carved into the sandstone, and agricultural terraces stepping down the slopes, and neighborhoods spread across multiple peaks and valleys, all connected by a network of paths and water channels. For over 1,000 years this city had been waiting beneath the trees, and no one had known it was there, because walking through dense forest reveals only what you can see from where you stand, while the aircraft overhead could perceive the entire pattern at once, the way one might suddenly recognize a face in a scattered arrangement of dots. The success of the 2012 survey led to an even more ambitious campaign. 3 years later, when the team returned with improved equipment and a mandate to scan nearly 2,000 square kilometers of northwestern Cambodia. The 2015 survey remains one of the largest archaeological LIDAR projects ever undertaken, covering not just the heartland of Angkor, but also outlying areas and the corridors between known temple complexes. When the data was processed and the digital maps compiled, the results extended the revelations of the first survey into something approaching a complete picture of Khmer urbanization. What emerged was not a single city, but a constellation of cities, geometric and orderly, connected to one another by roads that ran straight through the forest for dozens of kilometers, and by canals that linked the entire hydraulic system into a unified network. There were cities beneath the jungle that had never been recorded in any historical source. Cities whose names remain unknown, but whose streets and ponds and temple foundations were unmistakably present in the data. The Khmer heartland was revealed to be not a collection of isolated monuments in the wilderness, but a continuous urban landscape, a megalopolis of interconnected settlements that had once supported a population scholars now estimate at over 1 million people. The evidence of managed landscape extended far beyond the cities themselves. The LIDAR data showed earthworks stretching across the floodplains, low berms and channels that directed water during the monsoon season and retained it through the long dry months. There were agricultural zones where the ground had been shaped into regular patterns, suggesting rice paddies or field systems, fed by feeder canals branching off from the major reservoirs. The great Barays of Angkor, the Western Baray and the Eastern Baray and the others, had long been known and studied, but the LIDAR revealed the full extent of the tertiary water system, the smaller ponds and channels that distributed water from the reservoirs into every corner of the urban fabric. It became clear that Angkor had been not merely a ceremonial center with some surrounding population, but a true hydraulic civilization. Its entire economy organized around the capture and distribution of monsoon rainfall, engineered at a scale that rivals the irrigation systems of ancient Mesopotamia or the Yellow River Valley. The temples were the most visible legacy, built of stone that endured while wooden thatch decayed. but they had been embedded within a living matrix of water and soil and human labor. And that matrix could now be read in the subtle topography recorded by the lasers. Among the most striking discoveries was the true scale of Prekan of Kampong Svei, a temple complex located approximately 100 kilometers east of Angkor that had long been known to scholars but poorly understood. On the ground, the forest was so dense and the site so remote that comprehensive survey had never been practical, and the temple had been treated as a relatively minor regional center, important but peripheral to the main narrative of Angkor. The LIDAR data told a different story entirely. The complex extended over approximately 25 square kilometers, making it the largest Khmer religious site ever documented, larger even than Angkor Wat and its immediate surroundings. There were enclosure walls within enclosure walls, moats and causeways and temple mounds arranged in hierarchical clusters, and residential areas surrounding the sacred core that suggested a substantial permanent population. The site had been built during the reign of Jayavarman VII in the late 12th century. Apparently, as a major center of the Buddhist cult, he promoted throughout his realm, and its scale suggested that it had been far more central to his religious program than anyone had previously recognized. Walking through the forest at Prekan of Kampong Svei, one would see only scattered ruins and toppled stones obscured by vegetation. But the LIDAR revealed the architectural logic beneath, the master plan that had organized this vast sacred space. The surveys also identified hundreds of previously unknown temple mounds, small elevations in the forest floor that represent the foundations of shrines and sanctuaries yet to be excavated. These range in size from modest platforms a few meters across to substantial temple complexes covering several hectares, and they are scattered throughout the LIDAR coverage area, suggesting that the sacred landscape of Angkor was far more densely populated with religious structures than the surviving stone temples indicate. Many of these mounds likely supported brick or wooden shrines that have not survived, or their stone elements were robbed for later construction. But the foundations remain, waiting beneath the leaf litter and the roots of trees. Each represents a potential excavation site, a window into aspects of Khmer religious practice and settlement history that the great stone monuments cannot reveal. And archaeologists will be working through this inventory of sites for generations to come. The LIDAR has not answered all questions, but has instead revealed how many questions remain to be asked. How much of the Khmer past is still accessible to patient investigation? One of the more intriguing threads to emerge from the data concerns occupation of the Angkor region before the historical Khmer Empire. In several areas, the LIDAR detected circular earthworks and mound features that do not conform to the rectangular geometry of classical Khmer urbanism, suggesting that the landscape was settled and modified long before the 9th century kings established their capitals there. Excavations at some of these sites have recovered Bronze Age materials dating back 2,000 years or more, indicating that the region had been home to complex societies centuries before the construction of the first Hindu temples. The relationship between these earlier populations and the later Khmer remains unclear, whether there was cultural continuity or displacement, or some combination of both. But the LIDAR has opened up this question in ways that were not possible before, by showing that the apparent virgin forest conceals layer upon layer of human history. The Khmer built their civilization not on empty land, but on ground that had already been shaped by generations of previous inhabitants. And understanding Angkor fully may require understanding what came before. The work of analyzing and ground truthing the LIDAR data continues today through the Cambodian Archaeological LIDAR Initiative, known by its acronym CALE, a collaboration between the Apsara National Authority, which manages the Angkor World Heritage Site, and a consortium of international research institutions. The partnership reflects a commitment to ensuring that the benefits of this research flow to Cambodian scholars and institutions, that the technology serves local priorities as well as international academic interests, and that the growing archive of high-resolution terrain data remains a resource for future generations. Training programs have introduced Cambodian archaeologists to the techniques of LIDAR analysis and geospatial mapping, building capacity that extends beyond any single project. The initiative has also worked to share findings with local communities, many of whom live within the ancient city limits and farmland that was once part of the Khmer hydraulic system, helping people understand the historical significance of the landscapes they inhabit. As recently as 2024, researchers continue to extract new discoveries from the data collected nearly a decade ago. Improved processing algorithms and fresh analytical approaches keep revealing features that earlier analyses missed, whether faint road traces connecting previously unrelated sites or subtle earthworks suggesting undocumented phases of construction. The sheer volume of information contained in a comprehensive LIDAR survey means that no single study can exhaust its potential, and each new research question brings different patterns into focus. Some scholars are using the data to model ancient hydrology, simulating how water would have moved through the canal system during different rainfall scenarios. Others are comparing the spatial organization of Khmer cities to urban forms in other parts of Asia, tracing influences and adaptations across the Buddhist and Hindu worlds. Still others are combining the LIDAR with historical satellite imagery and archival photographs to track how the ruins have changed over the past century, documenting both natural processes and the impacts of war and development. The story of LIDAR at Angkor is in many ways a story about the limits of perception and how technology can extend those limits in unexpected directions. For centuries, the temples stood in the forest, visited by pilgrims and occasionally by European explorers who marveled at the carved towers rising above the trees without comprehending the cities that had surrounded them. The trees grew over the streets and the ponds silted in, and the earthen mounds subsided into gentler slopes, until the distinction between natural topography and human construction became invisible to the eye. It took a machine flying overhead, firing light into the gaps between leaves, to recover what the forest had hidden, and in doing so, the machine revealed that Angkor had always been larger and more complex than anyone imagined. There is something restful in this, the idea that the past waits patiently beneath the canopy, that time softens and conceals without erasing, that patient inquiry can recover what seemed lost. The jungle keeps its secrets gently, and the lasers read them without disturbance. And the data sits now in archives where scholars may return to it again and again, finding new patterns each time. As the evening settles over the forest and the temples cast their shadows eastward,